Before we get started with the video, I'd like to announce that the weather app promised that I would have a 0% chance of precipitation. And this is snow. So in February of this year, 2026, British author and accusation receiver Neil Gaiman made this post to his Instagram. It's been a while since I posted anything anywhere, but I didn't want to let any more time go by without thanking everyone for all of your kind messages of support over the last year and a half. I've learned firsthand how effective a smear campaign can be. So to be clear, the allegations against me are completely and simply untrue. There are emails, text messages, and video evidence that flatly contradict them. These allegations, especially the really salacious ones, have been spread and amplified by people who seemed more interested in outrage and getting clicks on headlines, rather than whether things had actually happened or not. Parentheses, they didn't. One of the things that's kept me going through all this madness is the conviction that the truth would eventually come out. I expected that when the allegations were first made, there would be journalism, and that the journalism would take the mountains of evidence into account, and was astonished to see how much of the reporting was simply an echo chamber, and how the actual evidence was dismissed or ignored. This piqued my interest. For one thing, I've been very interested in smear campaigns. Jesus. Does this look like 0% precipitation? What the hell? From looking at the Blake Lively case, I am very aware of how devastatingly effective a smear campaign can be. I also recognize the possibility of wrongful conviction, both in the actual courts and, the court of public opinion. If anything, the public opinion is more likely to skew into bias and to be fooled by this sort of thing, because at least with a jury, you have to sit them down and you take away their phones and say you cannot think about anything but this. It's not just like these heuristics and just these biases that people watch a really short clip or read a snippet and they decide. So if anything, public opinion can be more capricious than the judicial system, and I do not say that lightly. Gaiman also makes some pretty bold claims. He's not saying, oh, it's a gray area, I made some mistakes, I regret how I made them feel, however I've learned and grown. He is saying these allegations are false. And, if you're not up to speed with this, do not worry, we will talk about these allegations in frankly pretty excruciating depth. Gaiman is saying something falsifiable. He's saying, I have exonerating evidence. I have evidence that I am innocent, not just a better person now or not as guilty as it seemed at the time. He's saying that I am innocent and there is proof. His Instagram story continues, I was a journalist once and I have enormous respect for journalists. So I've been hugely heartened by the meticulous fact and evidence-based investigative writing of one particular journalist, whom some of you recently brought to my attention, who writes under the name of TechnoPathology. I've had no contact with TechnoPathology, but I'd like to thank them personally for actually looking at the evidence and reporting what they found, which is not what anyone else had done. If you are curious about what they've uncovered so far, the clickable link in my bio takes you to some really good investigative reporting. And the rest of it is an ad for his upcoming book. You might notice Gaiman is a very, very prestigious, or at least he was, acclaimed, very wealthy and respected literary figure. And so, at least for me, it was surprising when I read this and then I saw him link to a Substack. It's kind of like when you're in one of those really long Twitter arguments or whatever, and you ask somebody for citations and they link you to a Tumblr post and you're like, oh, okay, I was hoping for something real, but that's not to say that you can't house evidence in these areas. I know a lot of journalists are on Substack, and there's a lot of very valid things about citizen journalism, or certainly independent journalism, so I don't want to discount it based off that. The name is TechnoPathology, which is it's a pretty stupid name. It's pretty hard to take seriously, but, the title of this Substack blog is Neil Gaiman is innocent. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the allegations. We're going to look at all of the Substack articles, which I read. You're so welcome. And we're going to see how we're going to see whether there's any exonerating evidence. And if there is any counter narrative, we're going to see how that lines up with both the narratives of the victims and also the tangible evidence that each respective victim presents. For reference, I am a professional private investigator. That is what I do for a living. I do have a law degree. I am in the process of getting licensed. I'm just waiting on a background check, but regardless, I do not practice law. I am not your lawyer. I'll never be your lawyer. I'll never give you legal advice. This is not legal advice, okay? Really, I think what I bring to the table is when you're investigating something and when you're sorting through a lot of evidence, overcoming cognitive bias is a skill. It's a skill that you have to practice, and I think I have a lot of practice doing that. And I also have a lot of practice going through really significant amounts of evidence, particularly when there are conflicting narratives about how to interpret that evidence, and seeing how they align, seeing where they don't align, and concluding what I think is a reasonable interpretation. What I'm not going to be doing is I'm not going to be investigating in the sense that I'm going to dig into anyone's personal life. Absolutely not. I'm going to be using the publicly available information. I don't have any scoops. This entire video is alleged. Obviously, I don't want to have to say alleged every single time I talk about the allegations. Everything I say now is in the container of allegedly, okay? I'm going to flag ahead of time that I find the accusers to be very credible. I personally believe their accounts. I think the Substack, in my opinion, fell from the stupid tree and hit every branch.
What is someone supposed to do if not this? She now see it as a duty, an absolute duty. There is 3 questions here, but if anger is misdirected, ignorant, or blind, it could be just become another form of harshness. The rather extraordinary claim undermines the notion that these events happened at all. To top it all of, she's accusing Palmer and Gaiman of trafficking her. But there are also very standard NDAs, which are in almost all employment contracts standard. There's always been a sense that you makes yourself a target if one goes against the crowd. So does she stop it? Not really. She is almost putting the expectation on Neil to put the brakes on while driving forward at full speed herself. Brakes is spelled brakes.
It's poorly written. It's riddled with grammatical errors. It's not very well argued. So that kind of begs the question, right? What about this did Neil Gaiman find compelling enough to single out so remarkably? And I think that in its mediocrity, in its meandering, rambling rationalization of every crime that Gaiman allegedly committed, I think that it reveals something about the mind of Neil Gaiman and really broadly the type of person that would commit this type of crime. I think it says something honest about how he rationalizes these things to himself. Really, when it comes down to it, to the degree that TechnoPathology / Neil Gaiman, not that they're the same person, although we'll talk about something along those lines later. To the degree that they have any argument, it usually boils down to she wanted it. Let's start with an overview of all these accusations. We're going to talk about the parties involved, the timeline of what happened and what they say happened. I'm going to really avoid using anything salacious, for lack of a better word, as much as possible. So before we talk about the accusers and what they allege happened, there are 2 kind of pieces of business. The first is, let's talk about how the accusations first came to light, because that's going to be very relevant throughout all of this, unfortunately. So there is a podcast / media semi-conglomerate called Tortoise Media. They call it Tortoise because their whole thing is, breaking from the fast media cycle and getting slow media. Tortoise was the one that first broke this story. In July of 2024, they released initially a 3-part podcast on Neil Gaiman called Master, the allegations against Neil Gaiman. So I'm going to be totally blunt. I think that Tortoise screwed up the story. The primary accuser is a young woman named Scarlett Pavlovich. She was Gaiman's nanny. So, like almost all SA, it's not like a stranger in an alleyway. It happened within the context of this employer-employee relationship. For somebody who's familiar with coercive control, which I'll talk about in just a second, her story is really familiar in that even after the assault happened, she was still, talking fondly to Neil Gaiman. She's saying that she was attracted to him. If you know a thing about coercive control, this is not going to be remarkable to you. However, for whatever reason, the Tortoise Media people just didn't familiarize themselves with that, which is like the heart of every abusive relationship. As a result, they like clearly recognize that what happened was wrong and abusive and assault. However, they couldn't really square that with her sometimes being friendly or sexually forward with Gaiman. And because they did not have that coercive control framework that explains literally everything, because it kind of thing happens all the time, unfortunately, they ginned up this really strange, really kind of puritanical notion that because the sexual relationship that Gaiman and Scarlett had was ostensibly BDSM. I don't think it was, because that, requires consent. But they make the argument that it's impossible to consent to BDSM, which is crazy. That's just an insane thing to say. I mean, for one thing, it undermines people's bodily autonomy. Like, who are you to tell you pearl-clutching Brit telling somebody what they can and can't sexually consent to as a grown adult? My God. It also just doesn't read. I don't think it makes that much sense. And their approach really hampered the entire podcast. It hampered their investigation. It hampered their story. It hampered how they represented the victims. It just kind of fucked things up. Fortunately, about half a year later, there was an article in New York Magazine by Lila Shapiro, who has like this really long and respectable history of outing sexual predators. She did this really big, really definitive story on Joss Whedon back when he was having his reckoning. For the record, New York Magazine, there's so many. So New York Post is the shit one. That's the garbage one. New York Times is the one that has a good reputation, but is also now has kind of a bad reputation because they've been waging war on trans people. And that's where Ezra Klein works. And they gave Barry Weiss her platform, and they've just been kind of both sidesing their way into fascism. So cool. So I'd say New York Post, New York Times, and New York Magazine is just incomparably more credible than either of those. And, if I'm going to be honest, I think New Yorker is a little bit above there. Pretentious, I know.
The New York Times Magazine, published by the New York Times newspaper. Oh, Bobby.
I wasn't reading the articles.
New York Magazine is a very credible source. Lila Shapiro did this really in-depth article that did not fall into any of those absolutely bizarre... that didn't fall into any of those bizarre issues that the Tortoise Media podcast did. And it's kind of rock solid, Frank. Those are our two primary sources for these things. And those are the two primary sources that TechnoPathology will use as well. So that's the timeline of how the allegations came to light. Before we talk about them in any greater depth, I think that we should have more understanding of what we're talking about than the Tortoise Media reporters that screwed everything up. And so let's talk about coercive control. So during this section, I'm going to be talking about domestic abuse and IPV, intimate partner violence, as well as sexual assault, sexual abuse. I recognize that IPV and SA are different things, and they will necessarily have different dynamics. However, often they have that same core of coercive control, and a lot of the research about coercive control comes from DV research. I recognize it's not going to be one-to-one applicable to every instance of SA, not even every instance that we're going to be talking about here, but it is relevant. So our understanding of domestic violence really comes from two places. The first is, strangely enough, the Korean War. So during the Korean War, American prisoners of war who had been captured by the North Korean Communist Party and put in prison camps, they were defecting, or at least seeming to defect, at a rate that we had never seen before. We were hearing them go on North Korean radio and, talk about the virtues of communism, which, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of virtues to talk about in communism. However, they were also admitting to atrocities that they didn't commit. Simultaneously, we had American POWs being returned, coming home, and relaying accounts of being tortured. So the American military had this paradox. On the one hand, they're experiencing people defect at a really alarming rate. And on the other hand, we know that those people are being treated appallingly. This is where the arguable myth of brainwashing comes from. It was at the height of the Red Scare, and really just the idea of this brainwashed, hollowed out, the individual's gone, and now they're a cog in the collective communist machine that fit into Red Scare CIA propaganda very nicely. Fortunately, the U.S. military hired researchers who didn't fall for literal CIA propaganda, and they came to a much more complex understanding about why the prisoners of war did what they did. This is where coercive control really was coined. The researchers studying the POWs came up with 3 core elements of coercive control: dependence, stability, and dread. Basically, the playbook is to make people suffer in really unpredictable ways and deprive them of any type of personal agency. So not only can they not predict how or when they're going to suffer, but they can't control it either. They have no control over whether or not they experience that pain. And in addition to doing that, their captors would reward them sometimes. Essentially, the playbook is to make the world as scary and unpredictable and painful as possible, and then establish oneself as the only way that a person can find comfort from that fear and pain. So I said our understanding of DV comes from 2 places. That is one of the places. Also, in the 1970s, women's shelters started to open up. Before this, we didn't really know that much about domestic violence. It was considered totally in the realm of the private sphere. It was a private matter that the public need not burden its mind with. However, when these shelters opened up and all these women started sharing their experiences, it became really clear that not only did their experiences share really, really stark similarities with each other, their experiences were also very similar with those of the North Korean prisoners of war. So there are different charts. There's the Binderman coercion chart that comes directly from one of the Korean War era researchers studying coercive control. We're going to reference that to an extent, but just keep in mind just the basic framework of making the world unpredictable, making it seem scary and inhospitable, and establishing you and you alone as the only source of comfort, and also kind of creating this dichotomy where either somebody's going to get horrific punishment or comfort from you. That's the broad overview of coercive control. So first, let's talk about the accused. Are you a gay teenager? Congratulations, because you already know who Neil Gaiman is. I mean, I think even the handful of heterosexuals that have stumbled in here, I reckon that you know who Neil Gaiman is as well. Neil Gaiman, seen here in his most jaundiced, colored portrait, is a very successful British author. And he's also made a lot of movies and shows. I promise you've almost certainly watched or read one of his things, and if not, you've heard of it. There's the Sandman series, which is a graphic novel series about the titular Sandman. There's the book Coraline and the movie Coraline, which I remember being misleadingly marketed when it was first coming out as being created by Tim Burton, which is funny because the Coraline, the movie, is so much better than anything Tim Burton's ever done. There's also the book and TV show American Gods. He collaborated with Terry Pratchett too. He's done a lot of stuff. When I was researching for this, I had a flashback of watching Mirror Mask with my mom and being like, oh yeah, that movie sucked. So Gaiman was born on November 10th of 1960. His family was a very prominent, arguable founding family of the British Church of Scientology. In his quasi-autobiography, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, he describes really stomach-turning abuse that he faced at the hands of his father and, as a result of the church. As a teenager, he worked at the Church of Scientology. In his early 20s, he attempted to be a journalist before he pivoted to writing. He met his first wife, Mary McGrath, in 1970, and they married in 1985. They had 3 kids together. The first known allegation of SA happened 1 year after Gaiman married his first wife, in 1986. And again, just put allegedly in front of all of this in your mind, so you can save me the trouble. The accuser's name is Julia Hobsbawm. She was essentially his peer. She also worked in the publishing industry, and they knew each other through professional circles. At one point, according to her, she never felt like there was any type or desire for there to be a sexual or romantic relationship between her and Gaiman. At one point, she invited him to her apartment, no romantic intent on her end. And when he got there, he very, very abruptly and suddenly pounced on her, pinned her to the bed, and kissed her really aggressively, and she was able to struggle free and then run away. And they never spoke again. In 1993, Gaiman moved to the US of A to be closer to Mary McGrath, his first wife. By the 2000s, Gaiman was wildly successful. He had made a ton of money. He'd also been really successful and really quick on the jump in cultivating an online fan base. He had his own blog so he was really eager to feed this whole parasocial audience. And according to Lila Shapiro's article, by then he was known for sleeping with very young fans. Keep in mind, he was in his mid-40s. One of those fans was a woman named Kendra Stout. In 2003, Kendra was only 18 years old, and she met Gaiman at a book signing because she was a fan. So Kendra's 18, Gaiman is 43. They exchange contact info. This is what we like to call lawful but awful, where it's not technically illegal, but it sure is fucking gross. And, they stayed in contact. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when Kendra was 21 and Gaiman was 46, where they started a romantic and sexual relationship. According to Kendra, Gaiman was very, very interested in BDSM and uninterested in whether she was interested in BDSM. Throughout this point, I don't think even Kendra is alleging that there was any assault. It was just an unpleasant sexual relationship, albeit one that she consented to. This changed in 2007. The two took a vacation to Cornwall, which, just for fun and researching this, I sort of took a blank map and I guessed where I thought Cornwall might be, and then I looked at where it actually was, and this is where I placed it in my guess, and this is where it actually is, so take that, British. So during this trip, Kendra developed a really, really bad UTI. She said it was so bad she couldn't even sit down because it just hurt so much. And obviously, any type of, intercourse would be unbearable. Have you ever seen an outfit so green? I feel like I'm about to join a militia. Anyway, Kendra told Gaiman, in her words, "We cannot have sex. I will die." In response, Gaiman flipped her over and raped her. She said she was in agony. He knew it. She said no. She was saying no. And in fact, that was his response to her saying no. So that's our second allegation. In the same year, 2007, Gaiman divorced his first wife, Mary McGrath. A year later, in 2008, he met Amanda Palmer. Which, were you a gay teenager, woman/artsy non-binary? Congratulations, you already know who Amanda Palmer is. For those who don't know, she was originally with the Dresden Dolls. She's a musician. She writes rocky, folkish music. I would describe her as writing songs that Taylor Swift would write if she was dying of like a prion disease. So the two married in 2011 and they had an open marriage. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to indicate that they liked to share partners. In 2012, a 22-year-old named Catherine Kendall, I know Kendra Kendall, so it's Kendra Stout and Catherine Kendall. Those are two different people. They have similar names. I know it's confusing, but this is a separate person. Catherine Kendall. I'll just call her Catherine. So Catherine, she went by the pseudonym Claire in the Tortoise Media article, but she eventually came out with her full name. She was a fan of both Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman. She first met Amanda Palmer at a show. Catherine told Palmer that she was about to volunteer for a book event with Neil Gaiman and asked if Amanda Palmer had any message to pass along to Gaiman. According to Catherine, Palmer put her hands around her neck and whispered, "Hello, Neil," into her ear, and then told Catherine that she had permission to nibble his earlobe and that he's British. As if that's a positive. 2011 was truly a different time in terms of our perception of the British. I'm starting to really think that theater is evil. Anyway, Catherine met Gaiman after the book signing event, as she was planning on doing, and she hugged him and said hello. Gaiman responded by kissing her on the cheek. There's seemingly a dispute between the two accounts about whether or not she actually nibbled his ear. It truly doesn't matter. Sometimes discrepancies in memory are indicative of somebody lying or making something up, but a lot of times they're not. And this is the exact type of thing that is just, not only is it common, but it's really inevitable when somebody's relaying a 14-year-old memory. That later that night, Gaiman kissed Catherine on the cheek again. Ham, sweetheart, will you move out from in front of the camera? Come here, buddy. Yeah, okay. Hi, baby. So after all of this, Gaiman invited Catherine to another leg of his tour. So she agreed, and her friend went to the event, and then they went to the after party. May this type of party miss me. So at this party, before the end of the night, Catherine had mentioned to Gaiman that she worked part-time at a rape crisis center. And Gaiman responded that his friend, Tori Amos, co-founded RAIN, which I didn't know. That's amazing. Good for her. But he said that he could get Catherine a full-time job there if she wanted. So after the party, somebody was driving everyone home in like one car. Not enough seats, obviously. At one point, Catherine found herself sitting on Neil Gaiman's lap. He had a boner and he felt her up. After everyone was dropped off, Catherine's friend, who was sober, was going to drive Gaiman to his hotel room and then drive Catherine home. When they got to Gaiman's hotel, Catherine ran into the lobby to pee, and after that, Gaiman asked her to come to his hotel room for a few minutes to talk in private. And when she did, he started kissing her and groping her. He pinned her to a wall. She said that she just froze. And after a few minutes of her essentially not reciprocating, Gaiman stopped. After that same night, Gaiman sent her a very long, very, very complimentary, frankly, love-bombing email saying that he had never done this before, which is a lie, but he just liked her so much and he was asking to stay in touch. Again, Catherine totally starstruck and I'm sure flattered. Even if you're not attracted to somebody, if somebody that powerful is attracted to you, that is very flattering. Doesn't mean that you want it, doesn't mean that they can do it to you, but I get where she's coming from. Catherine responded enthusiastically. Gaiman's her hero. She told him that she liked the kiss and the grope. After this, the two had sort of a flirty friendship, heavy on the friendship. Gaiman clearly did a lot to establish trust. They just got really comfortable with each other. Gaiman was very sweet to her, except when he wasn't. Catherine recalled Gaiman telling her, just kind of out of the blue at one point, quote, "I don't know what I see in you. I'm an award-winning author and you are..." I mean, he's clearly trying to put her down. So during this e-crush/e-friendship, Catherine made it clear to Gaiman that she wasn't interested in sex. There are numerous conversations between Catherine and her boyfriend where she says that Gaiman isn't interested in sex. In one such example, she said that Gaiman didn't want sex and said that she was excited about that because, in her words, sex with Gaiman would be extremely gross and she'd be ashamed of it. In December of 2012, Catherine emailed Gaiman, quote, "Neil, I'm nervous and worried. I really, really like you, but right now I'm extremely overwhelmed and I genuinely think any more flirting would make me explode. My conclusion is that I'm hopelessly out of my depth here and should probably head to shallower water." So she's clearly very overtly de-escalating the romantic sexual components of their relationship. Very shortly after that, Gaiman started to escalate. Interesting. She told him one night that she couldn't sleep, and he suggested that she masturbate while on the phone with him. Shortly after that, Gaiman initiated phone sex, where he detailed a lot of patterns that are recognizable through the other victim accounts, interestingly enough, and also facts about Gaiman's anatomy that I can't really imagine how Catherine would have any other way to know. I think it's telling that after Catherine directly and explicitly told Gaiman that she wanted to just have a platonic relationship, he escalated the stuff. I've seen a lot of people say, well, if he was into BDSM, there are so many consenting people that would want to do BDSM with him. He doesn't want a consenting person. That's not the point. That's the whole thing that he's doing. Lack of consent is the point. What he's doing is it's about sex, but it's really about power. Why? I don't really know. I always think of this quote from this book by the PI who worked on this really infamous University of Colorado football case.
Freud said we confess because we project our parents onto the person we confess to. We hope that confessing will provide the parental unconditional love we constantly crave, despite our sins. He said it's also why babies love baths and adults love sex. I'm naked, love me anyway. In Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, a serial killer called the Misfit confesses to his victim before killing her that in the absence of God's unconditional love, there is no pleasure but in meanness. Unless we can have faith that we are loved despite our sins, we might as well do whatever we want and take pleasure in our power over others. We could become our own gods, accountable to nobody. The football players in our case were treated as gods, celebrity gods, as Calliope and Doonesbury described them. If you're God, who can you look up to? Who can love you unconditionally from above? Even Coach Riggs only cared about the players conditionally. If they scored, if they behaved, if they performed, if they won. This is just my theory, but maybe these players, like the Misfit, confused unconditional power with unconditional love. No pleasure but in meanness. Love me anyway, or I'll make you.
So the day after the phone where Catherine said she was just quiet the whole time, Catherine sends him an email saying that she actually enjoyed it. And notably, Gaiman was still saying that he was not going to have with her. But Catherine, she describes being torn between two parts of herself. One part was just this huge fan. Gaiman was her hero. She was giddy to be talking to him. She really valued their friendship. And the other was a grown woman who could see the troubling escalation of Gaiman's advances. So she was invited to another one of Gaiman's tour stops in Nashville, which she had mixed feelings about because of, that duality within her. She decided to attend anyway. She took some friends. The second they were alone, Gaiman immediately started to kiss her. She recalls him kissing her and groping her ass, and she said that she kept moving his hands from her ass, but he kept moving them back, and it stopped when other people came in. At this point, she was very uncomfortable. When the reading was over, Gaiman started signing books and told Catherine and her friends to wait in his tour bus. Catherine told her friends that she was starting to feel scared, and they came up with a hand signal, jazz hands, that she could use to signal to her friends that she needed help. When they were waiting the tour bus, Gaiman's assistant brought them whiskey, which they drank. Notably, I don't see any evidence that Gaiman was drinking. When Gaiman got back, he sat down with the group of people and patted his lap for Catherine to sit on it. She did the help hand signal, but her drunk-ass friends didn't seem to notice. Gaiman then took her to the back of the bus and then pushed her down and started kissing and groping her. She panicked and froze, a very common response. It's just like a super, super standard panic response, which, that prevents her from rebuffing him or pepper spraying him or whatever. But it also prevented her from playing along. Gaiman seemed to notice that and kept saying things to her like, "Kiss me like you mean it," and "Kiss me like you'll never see me again." Catherine believes that Gaiman recognized that she was not reciprocating and said, "Kiss me like you'll never see me again," as sort of a threat. He knew she was a huge fan. He knew that losing that friendship would be really devastating to her. After this, Catherine recalls feeling very foggy and her arms feeling heavy. And Gaiman eventually, after her just continuing to stay frozen for a while, rolled off of her and said, "I am a very wealthy man and I'm used to getting what I want." She didn't respond, so he said, "I'm really sad because I think I'm going to have to let you go." Notably, Gaiman does not really deny any of the core events here. He says he invited her there, thinking that she'd be down to fuck. He initiated the intimate contact and then stopped after realizing that she didn't want it. Notably, there is a contemporaneous record of all this stuff happening through Catherine's text to her then boyfriend. At 7:14, she writes, "I'm having a lot of fun. I shouldn't have dreaded this so much." About half an hour later, she texted her boyfriend, "So out of my comfort zone and there's nothing I can do about it." Less than half an hour after that, she texted, "I'm safe with my friends." 39 minutes later, she texted her boyfriend, "I need to leave." Her boyfriend hadn't responded to any of these at this point, and so she got frustrated. And at 9:36 p.m., she sarcastically wrote to him, "Wasn't sexually assaulted much or extremely harassed or touched too inappropriately. I'm an idiot for thinking I could just be friends with Neil Gaiman." The next day, she wrote in her diary, "When I hung out with Neil, I was really uncomfortable. When we were in the bus together, he pressured me. I think I was sexually assaulted." And, as if that couldn't get worse, very damningly, after this incident, we have a recorded phone call where Catherine confronts Gaiman about what he did, and he later offers to pay her $60,000 in remuneration. This is the first of 3 large sums of money that Gaiman will pay to women accusing him of sexual abuse within an 8-month period. In the phone call, he also claimed that in addition to paying her the money, he was going to make a hefty donation to a rape crisis center, and he fucking lied. He did not send that center that money. They said nope, no record of ever receiving that money from him. So, Jesus. That's the end of Catherine Kendall's allegation. From 2012, we get, not necessarily an allegation, we get a sexual partner from Gaiman who confirms a lot of his really aggressive and very specific details about his proclivities and says that he treated her like a toy. And this happened when she was 20. So sometime before 2014, Gaiman and Amanda Palmer bought this sprawling rural property in Woodstock, New York. This simple life, it was Gaiman's idea. Palmer was a city preferer, although, hopefully she found solace in the fact that her rolling hillsides were vibrant cities of ticks. Around this time, the couple hired a ceramicist named Caroline Wallner, as well as her husband, to essentially be the caretakers for their large estate. They would do work and keep things up in exchange for both room and board, and also in exchange for a promise that at some point, indeterminately, they would sell the Walners a 5-acre plot of land in Woodstock, which is a super expensive area, and they would build a cabin on it. Caroline Walner and her husband and moved in with their 3 daughters. Up until this point, Amanda Palmer and Gaiman had spent a lot of their time apart. You know, he was doing book tours, she was a touring musician. They didn't have that much time to do the domestic life together. Come on, bring it here. I'm not gonna get up. Bring it here. Oh my God. I literally can't reach it, dude. However, when they moved into that Woodstock property, Amanda Palmer, she was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and only child, I don't know why I said first. And the couple decided to spend time together and close their relationship. However, oh my God, dude. This is where I'm sleeping tonight, okay? Look, this open truck bed. I would have brought a tarp. They said there was 0% chance in the entire area. So Amanda Palmer shortly came to regret settling down with her husband because she started to learn more things about him, and she found it very disturbing. She confided one day in Caroline Walner that you have no idea the twisted, dark things that go on in that man's head. Over the years, Caroline's own marriage started to fall apart, culminating in 2017 when her husband moved out and Caroline started to really spiral. Neil Gaiman and Caroline Walner up until now had a professional relationship, but at this point, he started to take more of an interest in her. How sweet! What a kind boss/landlord. You know, he'd bring her juice. He'd worry about her health. He'd say she was losing too much weight. So at one point, Caroline was sitting next to Gaiman on a couch and she was crying, and he looked over at her and said, "You look like you need a hug." Aww. During that hug, Gaiman slipped his hands into her pants and squeezed her ass. Aww. That crying ass squeeze led to a 2-year-long sexual relationship between Caroline and Gaiman that would revive every time Amanda Palmer left. At first, Walner went along willingly. However, it became clear that Gaiman, wasn't actually really interested in a romantic relationship, and Walner pulled back. She started to try to avoid Gaiman, but she found that very difficult. For some reason, he kept an egg incubator in her living quarters, and he would just barge in constantly without knocking or letting her know he was coming to check on his egg. During one of these instances, Walner was sitting by her fireplace crying. She says that Gaiman barged in and wordlessly walked over and started tweaking her nuts. The line crossing got worse and worse over time, and one instance that we will very concerningly see echoed in other allegations. Walner was reading to Gaiman's son. He was laying in Gaiman and Palmer's bed and reading to the son. And they both fell asleep, and she woke up when Neil Gaiman got home. He got into bed next to them with, Walner on one side of the son and Gaiman on the other side, and he took her hand and grabbed it and reached over and put it on his crotch. Fortunately, Walner was horrified and got up and left. Walner became increasingly scared that if she didn't reciprocate Gaiman's advances, he would take away her housing, and he would also revoke the real estate promise. He would often call her for phone sex, and if she didn't comply, he would make these threats. She really recognized that their relationship was transactional at that point. That Gaiman actually explicitly said that. He said, "You take care of me and I'll take care of you," when she was talking about their encounters. By 2021, she'd had enough, and she stopped playing along with him whenever he wanted to have phone sex with her, and he immediately asked her to move out, and he revoked the promise to sell her that 5-acre plot of land. Let's pause and look at this through the lens of coercive control, and let's compare it against the Binderman coercion chart, which I mentioned that was developed directly from the experiences of Korean War era POWs. Isolation is one of the tactics. Notably here, Gaiman often was opportunistic. He picked isolated people, or in Caroline's case, only dove in once she was extremely isolated after her husband moved out. So we've got this really isolated woman who's mentally and physically exhausted. Basically, the moment she became a single mother in literally one of the most expensive places in the country, she became very financially dependent on Gaiman. He started by offering her comfort and concern, worrying about her, getting her juice. And when he started accosting her, it was in kind of the optimally humiliating and shocking times. He also deprived her of privacy. He would barge into her space. She couldn't avoid him even when she wanted to. This behavior fits the coercion chart very neatly. And the threat aspect of this is very real. She was afraid that if she stopped sexually complying, she would be suddenly kicked out of her home. And Gaiman confirmed that fear because when she stopped complying, he kicked her out. In December of 2021, Gaiman's manager called Caroline and asked her to move out immediately in exchange for $5,000. And she would have to sign an NDA that would restrict her from talking about any aspect of their relationship that she experienced while working for or living on their property. Wallner, quite understandably, balked at this. She said, "What am I supposed to do with $5,000? That she would have to move out of the area, and even then it'd be hard to get an apartment for that amount." So she told the manager, "I can't do shit with that amount, and also I'm going to need a huge amount of therapy after all of the abuse that Gaiman put me through." She herself admits to completely pulling this number out of her ass, but she said about $300,000. And they ultimately settled on $275,000 for her moving out and signing an NDA. Within a few months of Caroline Wallner signing that NDA, taking that payment, and moving out, Gaiman and Palmer hired a young woman named Scarlett Pavlovich to be their nanny. Scarlett's saga began when she was around 20 in 2020, and she met a 44-year-old Amanda Palmer. This was in Auckland. That's where Scarlett lived. Scarlett would do childcare. She'd just do odds and ends. She would run errands. She would organize files. And sometimes Amanda Palmer would even pay her for that. Scarlett, at the time, she was flat broke. During COVID, she had left/lost her job at a retail perfumery, and she had a stint of homelessness where she was literally just sleeping in a sleeping bag on the beach. And despite her really immense financial need, she was happy to just run these errands, despite the fact that Amanda Palmer would rarely pay her for them, despite her being an ultra-wealthy musician jet-setter. Part of the draw for Scarlett was she had, her childhood was really rough. She recounts really continuous and substantial child abuse, including beating, strangulation, really horrible stuff. By that time, she was estranged from her family, and so she really craved a stable family structure. And with Amanda Palmer and Palmer's son, she felt like she was kind of tapping into that familial love that she so craved. In February of 2022, Palmer asked Scarlett if she'd be interested in babysitting her son over the weekend. This would involve staying at both Palmer's house and also staying at Gaiman's house. Both of them lived on the island of Waiheke, which is a small island in New Zealand that is very, 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 very wealthy. It's just like an island playground for billionaires, which only good things can happen there. By then, Amanda Palmer and Gaiman had separated. They hadn't actually divorced, though. I think they're going through divorce proceedings now. I'm not certain. Even, years after the separation, they were still legally together. So yes, Amanda Palmer was setting up this very vulnerable, very desperate, broke, young, queer woman to be alone with her perverse husband. Their nanny had just quit, you see. Up until this point, Scarlett hadn't actually met Neil Gaiman. She knew of him, but she hadn't read any of his books, so she wasn't really a fan. So Scarlett agreed to babysit. She took a ferry from Auckland to Waiheke Island and, made her way to Gaiman's house. Shortly after she arrived, she learned that Amanda Palmer had actually scheduled a play date between her son and another kid, which meant that she'd essentially scheduled Scarlett to be alone with Gaiman in his house at night. So at first, Gaiman just worked in his office, and Scarlett just kind of sat there and read. Eventually, Gaiman came out and said hi, and they ordered pizza. He poured her several glasses of wine. He himself only drank water. After dinner, he suggested that she take a bath in their outdoor garden bathtub. At first she said no, but Gaiman, kind of implored her, and she was like, yeah, sure. He actually convinced her by saying that he had a work call and he wouldn't want her to be bored. So she acquiesced, and Gaiman showed her into their secluded garden with this clawfoot outdoor bathtub, which, hello mosquitoes, but whatever. So he showed her the fancy bathtub and then took off the roll top and then left. Remember, he's told her that he had a work call. So after he left, after Scarlett knew he was gone, she undressed and got in the bathtub. After only a few minutes, and mind you, this was after dark, she heard footsteps approaching her. Neil Gaiman had returned, and he was completely naked. Scarlett, surprised to see this 61-year-old man's saggy balls, pulled her knees to her chest and covered herself up. Gaiman then, without asking, got in the bathtub. Facing her, he made small talk and encouraged her to stretch out, aka put her knees down, aka reveal her body to him. She refused. Gaiman continued to pressure her to do that and said, "Don't ruin the moment." Scarlett recalls feeling at that moment a subtle terror. At 9:31 p.m., Scarlett texts a friend, "I am naked in the bath with Neil. I don't know how this happened. Don't reply, but need I remind you, she is naked in this near stranger's huge estate on a secluded island at night. She had to get directions to walk through like a secret path to even get to his house. She wasn't familiar with the island. She didn't know really where she was. She had a history of homelessness. She didn't have stable family connections. If I were her, I'd be thinking, is this rich pervert gonna fucking murder me? Maybe that's true crime brain or whatever, but it's a scary situation for her to be in. So when he asked her to sit on his lap, she said that she was gay, and also explained that she had been sexually abused by an older man when she was 15. And she also said that she was a virgin. Scarlett describes what follows as amorphous, which is very consistent of our understanding of traumatic memory. It tends to be traumatic amnesia is not really a thing. People can just not think about traumatic memories, repress it, but forgetting it, that's not really real. However, fragmentation, time dilation, that's all super common with trauma. A lot of people experience it in a flashbulb effect, where they remember certain pastiches, like cohesive images of a single moment or several moments of a traumatic event without really having a strong chronological memory of it. So amorphous, yeah, that's super consistent with what you would expect. So what happened next is horrifying. I'm only going to convey details that are necessary for our understanding of Scarlett's victimization and also of Gaiman's patterns. So this was a series of acts where Scarlett would clearly say no, and Gaiman would ignore that. This included a lot of BDSM adjacent dirty talk on Gaiman's part. He requested that Scarlett call him master. And it just, again, without getting too into it, Gaiman has some really specific and really recognizable recurring patterns with what he does to his victims. After Gaiman finished, he told Scarlett, quote, "Amanda told me I couldn't have you. I knew I had to have you. God, I wish it were the good old days where we could both f*** you." I've already mentioned this several times, but I need to highlight that Scarlett is gay. There's good reason to know that Gaiman was aware of this prior, particularly if Amanda was warning him away from her. Scarlett describes herself as being a, quote, "unabashed vocal lesbian around town." And Gaiman knew her through Palmer, who's also queer. Gaiman's immediate sexual aggression towards Scarlett, it's hard not to see that as a response to a perceived rejection from just her being gay, for her not being attracted to men. Which is to say that this looks a lot like corrective rape to me. So after the assault, Scarlett went to Palmer's house and cried in the shower before Googling Neil Gaiman Me Too, and she didn't find anything. Here's a picture that Scarlett took the morning after the bathtub assault. After Scarlett was done nannying for the weekend, Amanda Palmer texted some flowery bullshit about, the universe and whatever. She even offered to pay Scarlett. Isn't that nice? To pay your babysitter? And then she asked Scarlett to be her child's nanny. And this is so nice of her. This is what a good ally to the poor she is. She even offered to pay Scarlett, I shit you not, the New Zealand equivalent of about between 12 and 14 USD an hour for nannying for this an ultra lavishly wealthy woman. Okay. Frankly, even without all this other stuff, that would make me fucking hate Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman. It really would. Anyway, as indefensibly poor as these wages were, Scarlett was even poorer, and she agreed. I talked about the Tortoise Media podcast versus the Lila Shapiro article and how I was really unhappy with how Tortoise framed a lot of things. And this is really one of the first major points where I'm really frustrated with how Tortoise understood Scarlett's decision to be a nanny for Gaiman and Palmer. Because the podcast acts like her choosing to be a nanny after the assault is very strange and kind of unthinkable, which it's just not. First, there are the practical considerations. As I mentioned, at the beginning of the pandemic, Scarlett was street-level homeless. And in 2022, when Scarlett was proposed employment, she didn't have an income source, and also her lease was about to end, so she was essentially on the brink of homelessness. Once again, you don't appreciate this already. I want you to really think about the danger of being like a pretty young woman who is sleeping in a sleeping bag on the fucking beach. I mean, I was camping a little while ago, and it was a public land, but it was right on the border to private land. And the landowner, he just weird vibes, he just had weird vibes. And he drove past me once real slow and kind of scoped me out. And then I think actually 2 more times. And the last time he asked like some stupid question, and then he left. And I was like, oh my God, if I was a woman, that would have been the scariest fucking experience of my life. And I had a truck and a dog and a gun. Sleeping alone on a beach in a populated area as a woman, that's fucking terrifying. Anyone could happen upon you, and God knows what they could do. So this isn't a question of danger nannying for Gaiman versus the safety of not nannying for Gaiman. This is the danger of sleeping on a beach alone in a sleeping bag as a young woman versus the danger of nannying for Gaiman. For somebody who just had a very disorienting and traumatic and strange experience that kind of notoriously takes people years to understand and process, I think that was a rational choice to make. And there's also the connection that Scarlett felt with Palmer. She was so desperate for a sense of family, for these like stable, intimate connections with other people, like she had with Amanda Palmer and her son, that I get why she made that choice. I think it makes a lot of sense. One thing, Scarlett's violence and emotional deprivation really characterized Scarlett's childhood. People with these familial backgrounds often see cruelty as a normal part of a relationship. That's why predators so often target people who have been abused in the past. And Scarlett was just so desperate for that intimacy, that sense of familial love. Shortly after Scarlett began babysitting for Palmer, she wrote a diary entry about an experience that she had with Amanda's son where they were just reading together and like cuddling. That's it. And she said, "The year's absence of touch build up like a gray inheritance. I'm hungry. I'm so fucking famished." This is the image of a vulnerable person, financially, socially, psychologically. Also, as I mentioned, we have the circumstances of her relationship with Gaiman beginning with sexual violence. And frankly, Gaiman doesn't meaningfully dispute much of that narrative about the bathtub incident. He says that, yes, hours after meeting, he invited her to take a bath. However, he claims that she was aware that this was a sexual invitation and she was aware that he would be there and she was into it, which I think is so impossible to believe. You're expecting me to believe that a 24-year-old lesbian is just so into this 63-year-old man that she just met that she wants to have a sexual encounter with him in a bathtub? Like, it's so implausible. Give me a break. Only in the most delusional fantasies of perverted old men would that be something that's even on the table. Even putting aside the question of whether it was consensual, I want you to ask yourself, what type of 61-year-old man asks his nanny to have sex with him hours after they first met? So for all those reasons, I find Scarlett's account of what happened very, very plausible. Far more credible than Gaiman's, that's for goddamn sure. And that's important because it's extremely common for SA survivors to go into denial in the aftermath of what they experienced. I mean, it's a defense mechanism. If you refuse to acknowledge that it was assault, you can hide from the trauma, from the betrayal and the pain. You don't have to confront that in the immediate, as long as you tell yourself that that's not what happened. There are plenty of studies finding that up to 60% of victims of forcible SA refuse to acknowledge that was their experience even like years after. So for Scarlett to try to reframe what happened as being like a kinky sub-dom dynamic makes sense both practically, meaning that, if she accepted that it was assault, she couldn't take the job. She would have to be homeless. But if she went into denial, not only could she hide from that trauma, but she could also hide from the financial repercussions of confronting Gaiman. Makes sense to me, but I would wager that many of us, if not all of us in her situation, would do more or less the same thing. So as a result, Scarlett accepted the offer to become the couple's nanny. Like I said, I'm not going to be going into the graphic details of the things that Gaiman inflicted upon her, but just know that, one, the type of things he did to her, even little details like the language he'd use, the specific acts, even like using food as lube, they're very consistent across various different victims. Two, there is nothing dubious about the consent in these instances. Like it's very black and white. Like there are many events where Scarlett is saying or yelling no at him and he is not listening. Three, I'm no wilting violet. I've been exposed to many of such cases, and you can go and see for yourself. All this information is available. They mention it in Lila Shapiro's article, primarily Tortoise podcast, in Scarlett's lawsuit against Gaiman. It's all there. It's all out there. But if you don't want to do that, just when I say that the things that Gaiman did are shocking and really horrific, I am not understating. I'm not saying this of course all sexual violence is horrific and shocking, but like it's really bad, like really, 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 really bad. Take how bad you think it is and make it significantly worse, and you might be approaching what he did. And in line with that, I do need to mention that Gaiman assaulted Scarlett while they were in a hotel room with his son facing them. So this went on for a couple of weeks, and then Gaiman traveled to the UK, and Scarlett got COVID and had to self-isolate. While Gaiman was away, Scarlett was staying at his house alone, and after she got better from COVID, she went over to Amanda Palmer's house for dinner, and she asked Palmer if she could tell her something, and first she begged Palmer to reassure her that she would not lose her job for telling her what she was about to tell her, and Palmer said yes. And then Scarlett told her what Gaiman had done to her in the bath. After learning about the bathtub incident, Palmer did not seem surprised and allegedly said, quote, 14 women have come to me about this. She made it clear that she didn't say yes to it, that he just did it. She didn't tell Palmer about the many truly shocking and horrific things that Gaiman did to her in the days and weeks after that. However, once she told Palmer about everything else, she told her that the child was in the room during an assault. And she said that Palmer seemed really shocked, and then saying to her, quote, I've had to do this before and I can do this again. I will take care of you. A third party, a musician whose name I'm forgetting, and I'll edit in, Lance Horn, was present. So Palmer called Gaiman to confront him about the allegation about the child. And that third party, again, not interested, not involved, told Lila Shapiro that Palmer asked whether the child had headphones on during the assault, and Gaiman said no, and then hung up. Okay, happy tomorrow. So the day after Scarlett told Palmer about some of the details of what Gaiman did, Palmer emailed Wayne Muller. She was reaching out to ask about seeking treatment for Gaiman. She then flew to the UK, where Gaiman was staying with their son, and picked up their son. For a couple of weeks, Palmer seemed to at least try to make good on her promise to take care of Scarlett. She rented an apartment for her and had her over for meals. Scarlett also confided in some of her friends, one of whom was named Misma Aranu. So it just so happened that Misma's partner was a doctor of psychology whose expertise involves sexual violence and coercion. Although at the time, Scarlett, wasn't recognizing that it was assault internally to herself, so she didn't describe it as assault to either of them. They both clocked exactly what Gaiman had done. Near the end of March, Palmer texted Misma, quote, I'm glad that she had you to take care of her. It's been a rough month for everyone. Misma responded, quote, the majority of my rage is directed at Neil, before expressing that Palmer shared some portion of the blame because she put Scarlett in a vulnerable position, knowing maybe not to the extent to which, well, arguably not the extent to which Gaiman was a deviant, but knowing that he had a history of predating on young women. Quote, "Did you not see this coming a mile away? And yes, I know you asked him not to do that to her, but honestly, the fact that you even felt that was something that you should ask is fucked up in ways that defy comprehension." While Scarlett was staying in that temporary apartment, she texted Gaiman, quote,
"I had a very intense dream about you last night. Are you doing okay?"
Gaiman responded, talking about how Palmer told him that Scarlett told Palmer that she was planning to Me Too him, and as a result, he wanted to take his own life. "I wanted to kill myself, but I'm getting through a day at a time, and it's been almost 2 weeks now, and I'm still here. Fragile, but not great." This is a man in his 60s, suicide baiting a 22-year-old, so he then apologized for upsetting Scarlett, saying, quote, "I thought that we were a good thing and a very consensual thing indeed." Quoting directly from Lila Shapiro's article, quote, "Pavlovich remembers her palms sweating, hot coils in her stomach. She was terrified of upsetting Gaiman. I was disconnected from everyone at that point in my life," she tells me. She rushed to reassure him. "It was consensual and wonderful," she wrote. "Anaru had been triggered by something, I think," she added. Gaiman responded, "I am so glad that you messaged me. I thought you were a monster." End of quote from that article. Gaiman then asked Scarlett to speak to his and Palmer's family counselor, Wayne Muller, on his behalf, saying, "Knowing that you would be prepared to say, 'It's not true, it was consensual, he's not a monster,' makes me a lot more grounded." Wayne Muller then reached out to Scarlett at Gaiman's request. He offered to provide a safe harbor for her, which is fucking insane. It's so unprofessional. According to Mueller, quote, "What she called to speak with me about was feeling pressured from very diverse, mostly older women in her company to take action that she wasn't sure she felt comfortable taking. I accompanied her on a journey to help her figure out the answers for herself to that issue." In the following weeks, Gaiman promised to get psychiatric help. He didn't. Scarlett became a risk to herself and recognized that. She checked into an ER for a psychiatric hold. After that stint in the psych hospital, Scarlett asked Palmer if she could continue nannying just for her and obviously not dealing with Gaiman, partly because, quote,
"It would be good for me, I think, to have something to do and people to be around."
and partly because Scarlett's lease, well, Palmer's lease on that temporary apartment was about to expire and Scarlett didn't have anywhere to go. All available evidence also indicates that she was not yet paid for her barely minimum wage nannying work by either Palmer or Gaiman. Palmer balked at this, and she suggested that Scarlett go home to her abusive parents that she's estranged from. Scarlett understandably responded, quote,
"There is a reason I have divorced my parents. I'm starting to feel very much on my own and like I hate everyone."
Palmer responded, "I can't offer you exactly what you want from me, but I can still be here. Remember this." Scarlett responded,
"Babe, I am more alone than I've ever been in my life. If I hadn't gotten on that first ferry, I wouldn't be where I am now."
Scarlett then texted Gaiman, quote,
"Amanda keeps saying she will help, but it seems more philosophical rather than actually like she will help.
Gotta say, I think she's got Palmer's number on that one." And after a little bit without getting a reply from Gaiman, Scarlett followed up with,
"I've been thinking of you so much."
After that, Gaiman did reply. He said that he'd be happy to help. And then he sent Scarlett an NDA that was backdated to the beginning of her employment with them, aka the night of the bathtub assault. She signed it, and she finally received $1,700 for nannying. From Lila Shapiro's article, quote, 2 months after that, she received the first of 9 payments totaling about $9,200. So that is the 3 women that Gaiman was paying within an 8-month period after they each accused him of SA. And I think it's worth reflecting on how the amount that he was paying each woman was exactly commensurate with their respective levels of social capital and their ability to legally hold him accountable. So Caroline Wallner, who was the oldest and who also had a powerful lawyer, got by far the most amount of money. Then there's Catherine, who was an established professional by that point and was the second oldest and she got 60 grand. And then there's Scarlett, who had very little social capital and zero financial capital, and was also the youngest, and she got less than $10,000 USD. I think that reveals a certain amount of cynical calculation in the choice to pay each woman, and the fact that this proportional payment pattern is pretty consistent across all three women. I think it shows an awareness of the social power that each respective woman had or didn't have over him. And the concern for this social power, I think, shows his awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions, that he was both aware of and concerned about each woman's ability to hold him accountable. All of this happened in the first part of 2022. And as time progressed, Scarlett was able to move out of Gaiman's shadow. She was able to, move out of the immediate aftermath of the trauma. And she let some new and also old friends back into her life. And importantly, she spoke to other women who have been through this type of abuse, including Zelda Perkins, who is Harvey Weinstein's former assistant and who's now an activist opposing the use of NDAs to silence victims of SA. Less than a year after everything happened, in January of 2023, Scarlett filed a formal police report against Gaiman for sexual assault. The cops interviewed her, she told them everything, and then they told her that the case would hinge on whether Amanda Palmer would be willing to participate. According to Scarlett,
I said to them, she's a public feminist and she knows what happened. She'll want to protect me. I'm sure she'll speak.
But Scarlett was wrong about Amanda Palmer. Palmer refused to speak to police, and the case went cold. Quoting the Lila Shapiro article, whatever feelings Palmer might have had about the situation went into a song she performed on a tour in 2024, one she wrote shortly after Pavlovich's confession. It was called Wakiniwa, named after a park near their house on Waiheke. Quote, another suicidal mess landing on my doorstep. Thanks a ton. A few more corpses in the sack. You'll get away with it. It's just the same old script. The world is shaped to have your back. You said, I'm sorry, then ran, and went and did it all again. I don't think it's super respectful to refer to one of your husband's victims as a suicidal mess. Jesus. I actually misread, and it is a suicidal mass, which is somehow worse. While also refusing to lift a finger, even when the opportunity to do so, to create a case against this person who is repeatedly harming women, literally landed on your doorstep. So shortly after Scarlett filed the police report, she received this text from Gaiman. Are you okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the reactions to the allegations. As I mentioned, up until July of 2024, Gaiman was a chronically online progressive sweetheart, and he cultivated this really intimate, very parasocial fan base among online dweebs, frankly, by being so accessible on Tumblr and Twitter. He was outspoken in favor of trans people, women, refugees, and I guess all the other people that British tabloids went to hunt for sport. And this incredible feat of political efficacy that would surely put some sort of target on his back because of the sheer display of power, he put his name on an open letter asking Vladimir Putin to release Alexander Navalny from the political prison execution camp that he was in. Thank you. The petition was unsuccessful. And that's kind of the thing about Neil Gaiman. So he had all this acclaim. He was this wealthy, talented, well-loved writer. He had a reputation for being progressive and was just seen as a cool guy right up until that tourist media podcast dropped.
Tell you what, Peggy, my own mom never worked in her life. Home, that's what mattered to her, and she just kept making it stronger every day until the divorce.
Initially, there were 3 episodes, and they detailed only a portion of the allegations. However, after they first released, more victims got in contact with Tortoise, and they released a couple more episodes. As I mentioned, I don't think this podcast was well done at all. They made a lot of just horrible choices that absolutely baffle me. And although I will still maintain that it had the core credibility of the survivors telling their own story in their own voice, people found the presentation to be off-putting. Fortunately, there was that Lila Shapiro article that released on January 13th of 2025 from New York Magazine, and it's great. It's very credible, very thorough. Unfortunately, because of that gap in time, from the shoddy reporting from Tortoise and then the good reporting from Lila Shapiro, that gap allowed people who were already incentivized to disbelieve the survivors to gather ammunition and to really ingrain their bias in favor of Gaiman. There's no better example of this than the series by the Council of Geeks. I found these videos to be, frankly, pretty shocking, just how eager they were to overlook credible evidence. In this series, it's just abundantly clear that Vera, the host, presenter, and I guess the lead only person of the channel as far as I know, she just doesn't believe the victims at all. So the way she justifies it as a person who would otherwise ostensibly go to bat for victims of this type of abuse was by attacking the credibility of Tortoise and then acting like it's a given that the direct victim testimony in the Tortoise Media podcast was equally uncredible. Even after the Lila Shapiro article dropped, she clearly came to accept that Gaiman was a sleazebag, but there was no mea culpa. There was no reckoning with the credibility of the victim's arguments, and also the fact that she had spent a lot of time and energy and platform power diminishing the accounts of the survivors. Unfortunately, Council of Geeks is just an example of how the poor handling on the part of Tortoise Media negatively impacted the story. So that brings us to Gaiman's responses. Gaiman, it took him a while to respond. After the Tortoise Media podcast, he just went silent on all of his social media accounts. It wasn't until one day after Lila Shapiro's article dropped on January 14th of 2025 that he posted a response on his blog titled, and I'm not even joking, Breaking the Silence. Here's your ukulele king.
All aboard!
You can read the whole thing if you really want, but here's a clipped version. I'm far from a perfect person, but I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone, ever. At the time I was in those relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. I was emotionally unavailable while being sexually available, self-focused, and not as thoughtful as I could or should have been. I was obviously careless with people's hearts and feelings, and that's something I really deeply regret. To repeat, I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone. Some of the horrible stories now being told simply never happened. Well, some have been so distorted from what actually took place that they bear no relationship to reality. And he went silent for a while. It wasn't until 1 year later, in February of 2026, that Gaiman posted another statement to his Instagram account. You can read it in full, but here's a clipped version. So to be clear, the allegations against me are completely and simply untrue. There are emails, text messages, and video evidence that flatly contradict them. One of the things that's kept me going through all this madness is the conviction that the truth would eventually come out. I expected that when the allegations were first made, there would be journalism, and that the journalism would take the mountains of evidence into account, and was astonished to see how much of the reporting was simply an echo chamber, and how the actual evidence was dismissed or ignored. He talks about how the media is an echo chamber and nobody took this supposed exonerating evidence into account, and then we get the kicker in this monstrous run-on sentence, quote, I was a journalist once, and I have enormous respect for journalists, so I've been hugely heartened by the meticulous fact and evidence-based investigative writing of one particular journalist, whom some of you recently brought to my attention, who writes under the name of TechnoPathology. I've had no contact with TechnoPathology, but I'd like to thank them personally for actually looking at the evidence and reporting what they found, which is not what anyone else had done. And as I mentioned, the next slide, so 2/5 of his rape allegation response post is trying to hype up readers for his new book. It's time to look at the Substack. So when I had first set eyes on it, I wasn't that familiar with the allegations against Gaiman. I had listened to the Tortoise Media podcast a while ago, but I think I had kind of half listened to it, frankly, and I'm not positive that I had heard the additional episodes. I didn't like the podcast, but I also recognized that it contained the spoken testimony of the victims, and so I found that credible, even though I didn't find the podcast itself to be all that credible. I'm not going to pretend like I was unbiased going in, particularly when there are multiple women making these accusations. I don't think that it's by any means common or likely when a woman is accusing somebody of something that she's lying. That happens quite frequently, but I recognize that false convictions exist, obviously. But I mean, when there are several people, come on. And, to be honest, the fact that Gaiman was presenting this in the form of a Substack article or a series of articles, it didn't inspire confidence. I know that citizen journalists can be real journalists. I understand that journalism happens on Substack, but And look at it. Journalism happens on Substack, but does it happen like this that much? I don't know. It reminded me a little too much of how Johnny Depp's team tapped social media influencers with stupid names like That Umbrella Guy or Emily D. Baker to publicly go to bat for him. Still, you never know. And allegedly, TechnoPathology is a journalist, or at least has a background in journalism. And I did find out who he actually was, and yeah, he didn't lie about that. I'm only going to substantively address the articles that came out prior to Gaiman referencing this Substack. Gaiman was claiming in February of 2026 that the Substack contained exonerating material, and TechnoPathology is still posting quite frequently. So I'm going to go through the Substack and I'm going to look at the articles up to that date. And if I don't see that actual evidence, then I don't think it's worth continuing. So even with that limitation, I have to go through so many articles. And now normally with this huge amount of material, my strategy would be to read all of it and then pare it down to the relevant points, the themes, and essentially condense all of that material and respond to that. Unfortunately, that's not really possible here. In these articles, there's not a cohesive argument. There's not a cohesive narrative. There's not even really any strategy regarding how TechnoPathology is defending Gaiman. It's just a bunch of things. He's just saying a bunch of shit. Even within each article, it's just a slurry of claims and responses. It's even difficult to pare down a single article to its core points because it doesn't make any core points. It just makes a lot of points. So I can't boil it down to summarize it because it doesn't have enough substance to do so. And if I were to try, then, people like TechnoPathology or him himself, I wouldn't be surprised if he Googles his own name or moniker, would say, well, you didn't address all of these other claims. Well, or you missed this point or this point, because there are so many points and all of them are worth missing. There are quite a number of articles in here that I am comfortable just skipping entirely, and I will mention them. However, it's not really possible to just sort of winnow it down to core articles either, because same problem. There aren't really core articles because there's not a core argument. There's really no choice but to look at this article by article. And within that, I'm just going to have to skip a bunch of points because he just makes so many of them. It's just like a deluge of bad arguments. And so if for whatever reason you have read the article and you see me talking about it and I skip over a point, I'm aware of that point. I know. And I just don't think it's worth responding to. Frankly, I don't even think that, this isn't even journalism. What this really reminds me of is there's a 2010 book by Naomi Oretsky, who's the other Naomi, that describes how back in tobacco days, as opposed to now, which is just nicotine days, I guess, big tobacco and later big oil companies won the public media war for a very long time, not by convincing people that smoking didn't cause cancer or global warming wasn't real, but by seeding doubt. At the time, and this is particularly a problem for the tobacco side of things, there was the Fairness in Journalists Act, probably heard people talk about it as the Fairness Doctrine. That law required news stations, when they were talking about a contentious subject, to represent both sides of an argument. Even back then, from very early on, there was no doubt that smoking caused cancer. There really wasn't. And there was no actual public debate about it, not meaningfully, not scientifically. So Big Tobacco sort of fabricated a debate. They paid a handful of shill scientists to publish essentially nitpicks of the established science. And because established science has integrity, it will always have shortcomings. It will always have flaws, and it's just a constant process of improving that. That scientific process left the actual science showing that tobacco caused cancer open to nitpicks. So they would use these articles to gin up a sense of scientific debate where none actually existed. Then they would use that to exploit the fairness doctrine. So every single time the news covered any news about tobacco causing cancer, they would have one of their shill scientists go on air and just poke little holes, poke a bunch of little pricks in the well-established scientific media. And if you actually looked at things holistically, if you looked at the body of evidence with both tobacco and climate change, and now they're doing this with plastics, there's just no debate about these things causing these health impacts, these things causing these environmental impacts. There's no debate. When you look at it holistically, you have a chorus of affirming evidence and then some random little assholes shouting criticisms. But a lot of people didn't look at it holistically. Particularly people who were already incentivized to disbelieve that, for example, smoking caused cancer. This strategy offered an escape hatch for people who either were smokers and didn't want to reckon with the fact that they had a high risk of lung cancer, or who lived on Earth and didn't want to reckon with the fact that it is kind of ending because of us. The book is called Merchants of Doubt. That's what these scientists were. They were merchants of doubt. They did not actually publish anything meaningful. They did not add anything meaningful to any conversation. They just came in to sell doubt. And that's all they needed to do. And that's exactly what TechnoPathology is. So I think that if you conceive of him as not a journalist or even a blogger, but a merchant of doubt, his entire strategy makes a lot of sense. It starts to seem really familiar. With this in mind, when we're going through his argumentation, we need to keep the bigger picture in mind. The first way to do this, just going in to prep ourselves, is to ask ourselves, what evidence, at this point, knowing what we know, would it take for the reasonable person to decide that Gaiman is in fact innocent? And frankly, the fact that there are so many accusers sets a high bar that won't be easy to overcome. You know, the idea that a bunch of women from around the world would just conspire with each other to frame Neil Gaiman, it's just silly. It's a ridiculous idea. He's both too powerful in that accusing him will inevitably bring a lot of pain and probably won't get anywhere legally because of all his wealth and power, and he's not powerful enough because who fucking cares? He is a cultural figure and not close to being the most important one at that. So it's an extremely high sacrifice for very, very low rewards against a target that is just not worth it. It's just not worth it. And I feel like people just kind of intuitively assume that there's this incentive to accuse high-profile men of, deviance, but nobody has accused Obama of anything. Republicans still think that he's the Antichrist. So to circle back to my question, what evidence will we need to see to believe that Gaiman is innocent? Well, I need to see evidence that these people are concretely conspiring together. Not just them being mutual friends with the lead singer of REM, which we'll get into. I mean direct, compelling evidence that makes the idea that they could be working together even a little bit plausible. Evidence of women acting friendly towards Gaiman after alleged assault is not compelling evidence. That's just coercive control. That is really common in sexual abuse cases. I also need proof that these women, that really all of them, have directly lied. I need evidence in all of these cases to contradict what they're saying. So that would be evidence showing that they were not there, they were not in the same time zone, or testimony from somebody who was in the room with them saying that these things didn't happen, something. And hey, TechnoPathology claimed that Neil Gaiman had exonerating evidence that he published in his blog, so who knows? So let's crack it open. I've mentioned before, but he has just abhorrent grammar, and it just doesn't seem like he edits these at all. So after the end of every article, I'm gonna just play out some of the funniest grammatical errors in that article. It will not be an exhaustive list. So the first piece in this blog is from April 22nd of 2025 called
I was just seconds away from nirvana when someone shouted, "Run!" Buddhist ordination, the growing dark side of tech, and my wary, cynical yet optimistic return to online journalism. You lucky, lucky people.
This is unrelated to Gaiman, but it gives us a little bit of a chance to look into the background of TechnoPathology. First thing we learned is that he's British. Second thing we learned that he's not a very good writer.
Why, with my wordlings sitting so nice and pretty on real goddamn trees, would I climb back into the endless feeding trough of digital?
I mentioned before, but he claims to have co-founded Occupy News Network and The Canary, which he calls
the first truly professional online news platform.
Which, considering that The Canary was founded in 2015, is an insane thing to say, but alright. TechnoPathology identifies as a left-wing progressive. This article, and frankly his whole oeuvre, has more of an aura of enlightened centrism.
Hate for women, hate for men, hate for people who believe that men are women, or that men aren't women, or any combination of views. A fleshy sacrifice on the altar of self-improvement. Actual literal fascism. No thank you.
Next, we get an article on monasteries in northern Thailand. Not much to say there. Next is a 3-part series called Red Road, Black Road that's creative nonfiction on Native American struggles in British Columbia, which I know is exactly what we want from a British writer. Native American creative nonfiction. I know that's exactly what we all need. The only thing I have to say about this is that it's putatively based off of TechnoPathology's own experiences, and the main character has a code name Vortex, so very cool. Next is an article on meditation. Why wouldn't he make a new Substack if he was going to do a hard pivot like this? I don't know. It's not like these articles were popular at all. Like, I doubt the 0 people liking or commenting or restacking or whatever were going to be upset if they got deleted. What matters is that July 11th of last year, we get our first Gaiman posts. First 14 posts. In fact, first is just an index. Second is titled simply,
Neil Gaiman is innocent, a hellscape of smoke, but where's the heckin' fire?
Heckin' it's always so jarring because it's such a millennial word. If you're young, you're not going to be using that. However, if you're old enough to fall in the demographic that's using it, you're too old to use that. You're too old to talk like that. I'm so sorry. Anyway, the gist is TechnoPathology claiming that there's not only reasonable doubt about Gaiman's guilt, but that there's exonerating evidence to show that Gaiman is entirely innocent. So, big claims.
Shocking as it sounds, there is no compelling evidence against him. There is a great deal which exonerates him, and there is a lot that indicates an alternative explanation.
TechnoPathology then makes a very similar argument to Vera of Council of Geeks, which is that the Master podcast is terrible, which I agree. And by extension, they believe that the victims' accounts lack credibility, which I disagree. In fact, TechnoPathology links to the Council of Geeks video in this article, which would be mortifying if that were me. We also learn that, at least at first, this is a multimedia project. TechnoPathology is personal friends with a man named Igor Goldkind, who was nice enough to create spoken word jazz to complement this project, which is exactly as good as that description implies.
Waves are your faces, crashing in real time. Waves are your faces.
We get several paragraphs of TechnoPathology talking about how they'll be talking about abuse, then a clarification that TechnoPathology isn't anti-Me Too. They just think that sometimes women wrongfully accuse men, even though Me Too is still valid, which, revelatory. I think everybody agrees with that. Sometimes does not mean now. That's the thing. Anyway, after all this preamble, we get to a section titled The Parapet, in which TechnoPathology is sharing his credentials to establish credibility.
You'll probably be wondering who I am. I'm an NUJ accredited journalist. I've worked for a number of left-wing news sites over the years.
I looked into it, and to become a member of Nudge, which is the UK journalism union, you need to have a share of your income coming from anything related to journalism, even if you're not doing journalism. Meaning that, like a web developer who works on news sites, counts. So I can't say that I find the invocation of a Nudge accreditation to be very compelling, but whatever. I'm treating this kind of like I treat the Tortoise Media podcast. The actual mechanism for delivering the evidence might not be super compelling, super credible, super polished, but if the evidence is there, the evidence is there, okay? So we'll soldier on. We also get another song called The Wolves Among Us, which is genuinely one of the worst songs I've ever heard in my entire life.
Bob Black Sheep, hiding under your wool.
The next section of the article is titled
A Shot Fired from the Right.
I'm going to more detail in these first few articles than I will in the subsequent ones, because any competent writer will front load evidence, and also this is supposedly providing sort of an outline to the arguments that we'll see expanded upon in further articles. So don't expect this level of detail. Pray that you won't have that level of detail. This section is about how Tortoise bought The Observer, which is like another British news outlet, in a digital coup. The article doesn't mention dates, but the sale of The Observer to Tortoise occurred in December of 2024, which is 6 months after Master came out. So It shows that there is serious moneyed interest involved here, but it does not have any direct bearing on the podcast itself. It also doesn't explain why Tortoise would want to take down Neil Gaiman, who's not exactly anti-institutional. Like, he's not like an anarchist like Alan Moore or whatever. Like, he's making shows for fucking Amazon. He's making shows for Amazon, okay? He is the man. TechnoPathology then talks about how one of the primary journalists reporting on the Master podcast is Rachel Johnson, who is the Nepo baby sister of Boris Johnson and looks like a yassified Linda Tripp.
And I hate Linda Tripp.
I know that's right. Forget her. What goes around comes around.
Rachel is also a major transphobe. I don't even want to call her a TERF because she's not a feminist. She's just a conservative. She's just a right-winger. And frankly, that conservative outlook, as well as her prudish sexual politics, will really hamper her reporting. I mean, there's no denying that. Okay, so I expected to see some evidence by now. Any competent writer, reporter, anyone trying to convey information knows that they need to front load this compelling evidence to some degree. And so it's concerning that we're just getting preamble after preamble. Next part of the article is titled
Schrodinger's Survivor.
This is just telling you to be open-minded about listening to narratives about abuse, which I agree with, actually. Like, one of the main tactics of abusers is DARVO, which is deny, accuse, reverse, victim, and offender, which is basically leads to the victims being publicly accused of being the abusers themselves. And it would be wrong to take the people at their word. That would lead to a lot of victims getting smeared. Next section of the article is
Raising the Bar.
More preamble. That's it. Another Igor Goldkind song, which I don't know much about spoken jazz, but I don't think it should contain the word quite so many times.
Zen master and killed by other assassins. And an inept buffoon. Must have been right.
And the final section of the article, which is more preamble. Then the article ends. So, let's ground ourselves. What did we learn? We learned that Igor Goldkind is a bad musician.
An inept buffoon.
And that's about it. We don't even learn that much about TechnoPathology's approach, aside from, it's good to think critically, which... yeah. Thank you so much for enlightening me with that. Thank you. That wisdom has never even occurred to me before. That all of that training to achieve your nudge accreditation, it's just paying off right now. How did I never think of that? Think critically. Oh my God, how revelatory. Okay, next article.
Who is Scarlett Pavlovich, the woman behind the mask?
As I mentioned, I'm going to be skipping over filler, rambling, and unrelated details, as well as points that are either redundant or are too stupid to even acknowledge, which means I'll be omitting significant portions of each article. You're welcome. So we start with talking about Scarlett's background, and TechnoPathology reveals that he does not understand what family estrangement means. Remember, Scarlett claimed to be estranged from her family at the time that she met Gaiman.
In fact, in Master, she says, "My family think that this is about publicity. This is odd because she says she's estranged from them."
For Scarlett, as with many people, probably most people, estrangement means that she has a very poor relationship with her family and goes through periods of not talking. And when they do talk, they don't talk in a healthy manner. This is pretty standard for family estrangement. TechnoPathology acts like you're only estranged if you never speak, and the only other application of this term is a lie, which is very stupid. So after more filler, we get the next section.
Scarlett's timeline.
TechnoPathology starts by trying to figure out Scarlett's age. She mentions that she was 12 in a post in her blog from 2010. So, he deduces that she was born in 1998. He finds her exact date of birth in WhatsApp, and it's in late April. Therefore, according to this, assuming that that blog post was correct, she was 23, almost 24 when she met Neil Gaiman in March of 2021. Yet Master claims that she was 22. TechnoPathology criticizes 22 as being significantly younger, which I personally don't think that 22 is significantly younger than 23. Them getting the age wrong would be really sloppy. That'd be pretty bad. But the actual age doesn't make that big of a difference on the story. However, TechnoPathology disagrees.
Why is this important? Mostly because the entire coverage of Scarlett has worked to exaggerate her vulnerability, to draw a character portrait of her as young, as poor, when she was anything but, as overall the sort of person who should obviously be off limits. At this point, a difference of a few years does start to look like twisting things.
First of all, the Lila Shapiro article, aka the one that you're giving credit for getting it right, is the most pivotal piece of media coverage. It just so happened that the Tortoise Media one was first. First and most important are not the same thing. Second of all, again, 22 and 23 is not the difference of a few years. It's a year. It's almost 2 years, but it's not. That's how age works. This is so trivial. It truly doesn't matter. Particularly when the age disparity was decades, not a few years. And also, she's not off limits because she's 23 and not 22. She's off limits because she is an unconsenting lesbian employee. Next, TechnoPathology makes a point that Scarlett was not as poor as she said she was. Remember, Scarlett's story was that she was working at a perfume shop and then lost her job during COVID and became homeless for a period of a few weeks. To counteract this narrative, TechnoPathology posts a picture of when she was working at the perfume store saying,
after a brief stint as a retailer, she gets a promotion and becomes manager of the store. Many people believe that she was homeless, unemployed, and destitute. Essentially, she has responsibilities. She's in charge of people. She was liaising with wholesalers and international clients. She trained new staff. She ran the store.
I hate the British. I really do. You people must have truly no class mobility if your shittiest journalist has such little understanding of what it means to work as a manager at a small business. First of all, was she the manager or the GM? That makes a difference for pay. Either way, it's very common for managers to get paid like absolute trash. After undergrad, I was working at like a prep cook at a very shitty fast food chain. The store is going under in my location and later every location in the state, deservedly. And during this process of getting zero business, they were running through a bunch of GMs. They had offered me the position like 5 times during my year of working there, and I would always turn it down because I saw how much they worked. They were working way more than 40 hours a week, and they wouldn't get paid overtime because it's salaried. And so I had worked out that I would actually get paid way less than I was making at my already shitty role. And this is super common for low-wage jobs. And the perfumery is a small business, which tend to pay their workers less. Talking about the fact that she was a manager at a boutique retail store and assuming that she made bank from it is delusional. It's delusional. Like, it's a type of delusion that you could only find in a British white-collar worker who had enough money to take year-long trips to monasteries in northern Thailand.
She also had no major issues at work. In fact, she was able to perform her role very well. This is important because she will attempt to exaggerate her mental illnesses in the complaint document. In the DSM-5, many diagnoses use the benchmark of whether the symptoms interfere with the ability to function normally. For instance, depression itself is a common enough feature of human life, but for a diagnosis of severe depression, clinicians look to see if it interferes with the ability to hold down a job, among other markers of function. Scarlett was clearly able to live a normal life.
First of all, I don't think she had been working there for that long. Second of all, she did lose her job, albeit likely due to COVID. Third of all, working at retail isn't evidence that somebody's lying about the extent of their childhood trauma. What? Like, I feel like I don't even need to comment on this. It's so stupid. Exactly how destitute does somebody need to be to believe that they're actually mentally ill or that somebody actually mistreated them as a child? Exactly. Is there a number? Is there a number, like an income, a salary range, a tax bracket? TechnoPathology then goes on to scrutinize Scarlett's claims of experiencing childhood abuse. Lila Shapiro's article describes Scarlett's childhood thus, quote, "Violence, Pavlovich tells me, was normalized in the household. One close family member beat her with a belt. Another would strangle Pavlovich when she got upset and slap her across the face till her cheeks were raw." TechnoPathology responds,
on the subject of violence, I'd sat that physical punishment is still quite prevalent in New Zealand society and doesn't really raise eyebrows. That's not to say it shouldn't, but it's unfortunately not uncommon to see parents hit their kids in public, despite being made illegal in 2007. So the normalization of violence doesn't necessarily indicate anything unusual. Strangling would be unusual though, but essential details are lacking.
Okay, I'm in the, don't hit kids camp, but beating and physically punishing somebody are two different things. And I know that because words have meaning. Also, strangling is not just unusual. Presence of strangulation raises the risk that the abuser will kill you somewhere down the line by over 700%. Hand-waving this by saying, oh, the essential details are lacking, aka they didn't include enough for me to get pedantic about it, it's just coward horseshit. TechnoPathology then writes,
she also mentions only 3 examples. Were they ongoing and frequent, or just 3 events?
What do you mean, was it ongoing? Violence was normalized. Scarlett said that a family member would strangle her when she got upset. Does that sound like something that only happened 3 times? Do you think that a child only ever got upset twice throughout her childhood? Also, would strangle her. I understand that technopathology does not know much about grammar, but that's habitual past tense. It's something that happened habitually in the past. Technopathology then posts a picture of Scarlett from when she was a child that he dredged that from an old blog and says,
"One can never tell, but it appears she was a happy, healthy child from a middle-class family."
Oh, you're so right, King. One can never tell. Therefore, looking at a happy photo at some point in her childhood literally tells me nothing. I literally cannot tell anything from this. I'm skipping over technopathology investigating the contents of Scarlett's blog from when she was like 15. A 15-year-old's fashion blog is not an authentic representation of their life. It's irrelevant. So let's jump towards a time period that is relevant, 2020 and 2021. Technopathology dug up a picture of Scarlett where she was featured in an article about homelessness as a homeless person, which supports Scarlett's claims of being homeless, but he just ignores that. And then the rest of the article is about how Scarlett participated in a local theater-related productions. You mean to tell me that an Amanda Palmer fan is into theater? I think the implication is that her acting means she's attention-seeking.
She's doesn't come across as unhappy, but rather positive and excited about life. Nor does she come across as any more vulnerable than her peers. The way she lives her life is strikingly headstrong, self-assured, independent, resourceful, and assertive. She seeks the limelight. She seeks connections with celebrities, and she is not shy about attention and publicity.
This is very stupid. That is a preposterous logical inference to make. Also, it seems like we're forgetting the fact that people portray their lives in a positive light on social media. This is a near universal fact. This does not cast any doubt on Scarlett. All it really says is, again, this queer theater kid likes Amanda Palmer, which is not exactly revelatory. So that's the big Who is Scarlett Pavlovich article. And what new facts did we learn about any of her allegations? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She had a childhood, and during that childhood, she had a blog. Can you believe it? She worked as a manager at a small retail business and was still poor. Isn't that shocking? I counted 7 wrong "it's" in this article, and the most embarrassing writing errors are...
On the subject of violence, I'd sat that physical punishment is still quite prevalent in New Zealand society, in ways that suit the prosecution of her case in the courts both of law and of public opinion.
Okay, next up.
Did Scarlett consent?
Technopathology starts by claiming that,
in this case, the evidence of consent is unusually stark.
And then presents this exchange between Gaiman and Scarlett. Gaiman says, "She said you were telling lots of people about you and me and saying it was not consensual, and you were thinking of me tooing me, and that you would not be able to see me when I returned, and that people on Wahiki would shun me. It was very unstabilizing. I spent a week actively not killing myself, if you see what I mean. She told me not to text you, as it would only make things worse."
The more I hear, the more I am dying inside. I can't believe this has been told to you. It's absolutely not true. I feel sick to my stomach. Of course you are actively not killing yourself. This is incredibly, incredibly terrifying. I'm so fucking relieved I messaged you. I am so sorry. No one knows what happened apart from my friend M. Oh man, I just need to digest all this.
Here, we see a 60-something-year-old man threatening to take his own life if a 20-something Me Too's him. That is an insane thing to do. I've known so many women whose shitty boyfriends weaponize these types of threats. And this is a threat. He is telling her, if you do this, you may be responsible for my death. It is, to say the least, extremely manipulative. And Scarlett, as intended, panics. She says that this is incredibly terrifying. Here, Gaiman is inducing terror and then establishing himself as the only way to relieve that fear. This is coercive control. Scarlett responds by saying,
"I've told Amanda that even though it began questionably, eventually it was undoubtedly consensual and I enjoyed it."
Technopathology says,
Master, of course, zooms in on questionably rather than undoubtedly consensual. Questionable does not mean non-consensual, and it's not certain what element is questionable. There's always ways to do better.
Well, there's a reason why Master zooms in on the questionable part. Like, the crux of Technopathology's argument is that Scarlett acted fawning and didn't call the cops and I guess pepper spray Gaiman and run off screaming naked into the New Zealand night. Therefore, she's a liar. And here's the problem. Even if Scarlett's Scarlett's behavior after the assault was evidence of a loving relationship rather than coercive control. I mean, hell, even if Scarlett herself said, like, this relationship was loving and joyful, it still began with an assault. Casting aspersions on Scarlett's behavior after the assault does not change the initial nature of that interaction. The fact that Scarlett says it began questionably is an obvious reference to the bathtub assault, and Gaiman does not respond to this claim. That is pretty strong support in my mind. If my husband said, our relationship began questionably, but now I like you, I would say, what do you mean? And remember, there's no argument about whether they had an encounter in the bath. The notion that this encounter between a 20-something lesbian and a 64-year-old man who's employing her and who she had just met a couple hours ago and had one conversation with, after he gave her several glasses of wine without drinking any himself, the idea that she would be down to fuck is doubtful, let's say. Now, with that in mind, seeing Scarlett refer to it as questionable and seeing Gaiman fail to comment on that adds more credibility to her account. And TechnoPathology claims that Scarlett talking to Wayne Mueller, the family therapist, is further evidence that she's lying. To me, the idea that somebody's family therapist calling you to exonerate their client it's so unprofessional. I cannot imagine any credible therapist doing that. And consider that this happened immediately after Gaiman had freaked Scarlett out, frankly, by suicide baiting. Talk about being put under pressure. Talk about being coerced. No wonder Scarlett responded by fawning. Gaiman reached out and said, "I will die because of you." When she panicked and tried to soothe him, he immediately leveraged that to get him off the hook with the family therapist. This is such an extraordinary level of coercion, particularly given the fact that when this happened, Scarlett was just in a psych hospital for ideation as a direct result of that assault. Which is why when I see Scarlett apologizing again and again, it strikes me as the action of somebody who's panicked, not somebody who's actually apologizing. TechnoPathology then blames Misma for essentially planting the idea that she was assaulted in Scarlett's head. I guess we're just going to presuppose that Scarlett is an idiot, is just a baby-brained, Play-Doh-y child who can just be convinced that her experiences are or aren't assault, and that Misma, for some reason, would do this. We're just going to presuppose that all of this is true. That makes perfect sense. We then move on to the details of the bathtub assault that Scarlett presented in the podcast. Again, I'm not going to go into excessive detail because I think that'd be disrespectful and unnecessary. Scarlett says,
"We still had some time to kill, apparently, so he said, 'Do you want to have a bath?' And I was like, yeah, sure." And he said, "I'll run you a bath." And I know, Rachel, I know it sounds crazy, but I truly thought nothing of it.
TechnoPathology responds,
"What sounds crazy? She sounds a little defensive. No one's asking, did you see that as a proposition? But she acts as if that would be the follow-up question before it's made. Gaiman, in a court statement, says it was clear that he was inviting her to take a bath with him."
Well, that's a weird invitation. That would make me uncomfortable. I can understand how Scarlett would look back and marvel at how odd his offer was, though I don't by any means think that accepting the offer sounds crazy. She's not at fault for trusting that this old man wouldn't try to assault her. This sets the tone for TechnoPathology's method of discrediting Scarlett. He takes her normal, understandable fear reactions and pretends like they're somehow unusual and evidence of contemporaneous consent. In response to Scarlett's reaction to Gaiman getting in the bath, he says,
"So at this point she could have said, 'I didn't expect you to get in the bath with me,' or she could have simply left. Instead, she stays."
This is personally insulting. TechnoPathology is assuming that I am so stupid and so unfamiliar with the dynamics of violence that I wouldn't clock Scarlett's freeze response as being totally normal. In reality, you could leverage this "you didn't respond right" general method of discrediting somebody against pretty much every single sexual assault survivor that has ever existed. If the victim fights back, then they escalated. If the victim freezes, well, then they should have fought back. The reality is that sometimes freezing does prevent escalation, and sometimes that's the right thing to do. In this case, it especially makes sense when Scarlett, it was at night, she was in a slippery bathtub in the middle of this man's estate. She didn't really know where she was, and if she got up, she would expose her entire nude body to this person who suddenly revealed himself to be a threat to her. At 9:31, Scarlett texted to her friend,
"I am naked in the bath with Neil. I don't know how this happened. Don't reply, but fuck.
TechnoPathology states that the don't reply request indicates that Scarlett didn't feel like she was in danger. I read that more as like I'm afraid of him seeing that I texted you about this. We then get this, I guess, exchange between TechnoPathology and Scarlett, starting with her saying in Master.
He ended up sort of asking me to put my legs down, and I ignored him.
We should note that he is asking. She is not compelled to put her legs down, thus revealing her body. But the next time he asks, she does. There is no force here. There is an action freely taken at Gaiman's request.
He asked me again and sort of gestured, so I put them down.
At this point, it would be very clear that this is a sexual situation. There's no reason to ask someone to reveal their body in this way, if not for sexual reasons.
This is so appalling, dude. This is so appalling. We have a creepy old man at night with a naked, gay, young woman. He asks her to put her legs down. She ignores it. And then he asks her again and gestures, and she finally acquiesces. And then TechnoPathology is like, well, there you have it. Consent. No, bitch. All I see is Gaiman not taking no for an answer. Gaiman then asks Scarlett to sit on his lap. She responds she's gay, she's never had sex, and that she was abused by an older man when she was a teenager. And Gaiman continued to insist. TechnoPathology says,
while anyone who wishes to can identify as a lesbian for whatever reason, sometimes as a political statement, for instance, she has had quite a few relationships with men.
I'm sorry, did she say I'm a political lesbian? Like, of course not. Of course she didn't. Every single time TechnoPathology is presented with opposing evidence, he pretends like words don't mean things. And it's not unusual for gay people, particularly women, to be in heterosexual relationships before they come to term with their sexuality. It's compulsory heterosexuality. There's a term for it. It's so common. And I'm not harping on the fact that Scarlett is gay because I expect her to be like a gold star lesbian or something. I'm harping on it because these allegations look a lot like corrective rape to me, which is when a man sexually assaults a queer woman to heterosexualize her, or as an act of lashing out from the perceived rejection that her being not interested in any men presents to them.
Even if this is a factual account, what is actually shown? If we break down each action rather than the total mood, framing, and presentation, we see Gaiman asked her to sit on his lap. He didn't order or force her to. She doesn't say no to sitting on his lap. She tells Johnson that instead she mentions that she was gay and had once been sexually abused. We are supposed to read this as an objection, but was it? She doesn't actually mention refusing to sit on his lap.
Technopathology loves to pretend that forcible assault isn't the only kind of assault. It's not. Coercion exists, and the pedantry here. He asks her to do something, she doesn't do it, and she tells him all the reasons why she doesn't want to. That's her denying consent. Once again, words don't have meaning the second they show Gaiman's guilt. The rest of Technopathology's attempted takedown of Scarlett's account follows the same trajectory. She says no multiple times. When that happens, Technopathology just mentions it and moves on. And when she doesn't say no, after saying no multiple times, Technopathology acts like this is implied consent. It's rank, it's grotesque, it's frankly run-of-the-mill rape apologia. Technopathology then goes through a portion of Scarlett's civil case against Gaiman that essentially restates her allegations only in bland legal language. And there's a ton of incorrect, half-baked, unresearched legal speculation about the American courts from a British amateur. I'm going to talk about this later, but you might have seen somewhat recently articles about her suit against Gaiman being dismissed. That did happen based exclusively on jurisdictional grounds. So she was suing in the United States for something that happened in New Zealand. So the court found that they did not have jurisdiction just because of location. And Scarlett appealed, and they actually just had oral arguments for their case. We'll see what happens with that. But either way, this is not a ruling on the substantive matter of her civil case. This is just a procedural thing. So did this article offer evidence? No. Did it offer anything exonerating? No. It was just an exercise in the same bland excuses that you'll see from really any defense attorney during any trial where any creepy old man has been accused of hurting women. Here are my favorite grammar errors.
Friend Misma, has for whatever reason, decided to characterize Scarlett and Neil's consensual relationship as non-consensual. There is 3 questions here.
The next article is just a collection of links. The one after that is called
Neil Gaiman is Innocent. Was Scarlett trafficked?
Joy of joys, we get another Igor Goldkind song where everybody sounds out of tune.
Waves are your faces.
I'm not even going to cover this article because honestly, I don't think the question is important to the core debate over whether Gaiman is a predator. Assault is assault. This is just a retread of TechnoPathology doubting that Scarlett was poor, failing to understand consent. He doesn't even present any meaningful evidence. He doesn't make any novel arguments. It's just a series of exhausting and meritless attacks on Scarlett's character, and I don't want to platform that. Remember, my focus is on addressing the SA allegations. SA is the precursor to trafficking, and so whether what happened legally qualifies as trafficking doesn't actually have any bearing on the question of whether she was assaulted. And from here on out, I'm just going to ignore anything involving the trafficking claim. It is just not, for our purposes, it is not relevant. Next article is...
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Was Scarlett paid?
The yes or no of this question is really only relevant to the trafficking claims. The answer is yes, but she was paid very little and very late because Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman are bad people. Okay, happy next week. Next article.
The weaponization of a child.
This is related to the claims from Scarlett and Caroline Wallner that Gaiman assaulted them in front of his son. As a horrible refresher, in Wallner's case, this happened when her and Gaiman were laying in a bed and the child was laying between them. And in Scarlett's case, this happened when Gaiman and his son were in a hotel room and the son was facing them as it happened. And in one of the two instances with Scarlett, Gaiman also reached around the child to initiate contact. This was when Scarlett and Gaiman were sitting on a couch with the son between them, and Gaiman reached around to grope her. So TechnoPathology starts this article by whining about how a Reddit user, just not a special Reddit user, just some person, was urging people not to buy Gaiman's books on the ground that he committed CSA.
Each time, this individual urges neutral parties not to buy Neil Gaiman books or merchandise. They are not directing their comments towards any positive action that would show concern for the child's safety.
A true bastion of journalism. So this article is an attempt to address those claims because they are very, very damning and very serious. So he acts like it's suspicious that neither Caroline Wallner nor Scarlett went to the cops with the CSA allegations. Wait, what's that you say? Scarlett did go to the police? Well, TechnoPathology for some reason assumes that she just didn't tell the cops about that. A claim for which he gives no basis. He sort of talks like he's heard the whole police interview, but I don't see any evidence that has been released. If there is evidence that Scarlett did not mention this to the cops, then I have not seen it, and TechnoPathology does not provide it.
I should think a decent person would immediately go to the police if they felt that CSA had taken place. Perhaps first going to Amanda Palmer, the mother, but there's no sign of any of this.
What do you mean there's no sign of this? Because in addition to going to the cops, Scarlett also went to Amanda Palmer and told her what happened. Here's an excerpt from the Lila Shapiro article that recounts Scarlett telling Palmer about Gaiman's allegations. Quote, Pavlovich waited until the end to tell Palmer about the child being present in Auckland. Afterwards, she recalled Palmer was silent. She appeared shocked. Did TechnoPathology forget a major part of one of the two media pieces that he's sourcing most of his information from? Or is he just frankly lying to discredit Scarlett? Reasonable minds may differ. By omitting any mention of Scarlett telling Amanda Palmer, TechnoPathology also skirts around a very strong piece of confirmatory evidence. This is from the Lila Shapiro article again, quote, Palmer called Gaiman that night. According to Lance Horn, the musician, she asked Gaiman whether her son had been wearing headphones while he and Pavlovich were in the hotel room. He replied no, then hung up. This could be easy to miss, but we have a third-party witness attesting to the fact that Amanda Palmer confronted Gaiman over the presence of her child, and that Gaiman essentially confirmed that occurred. Lance Horn has no affiliation with Scarlett, as far as I can tell, and any argument that his friendship with Palmer was reason to lie fails as well. Frankly, I think that the fact that Palmer was aware of these CSA allegations and has not taken stronger steps to try to get custody doesn't look great on her. I understand that it's very complicated, very messy. Somebody with a lot more money than you can really mess you up in court, particularly in custody cases. But still, I do not think that this makes Amanda Palmer look great. Also, regarding Caroline Wallner, not going to the cops is not a sign that somebody is lying. It's super common for victims to believe that cops won't believe them and won't investigate, which is exactly what happened when Scarlett went to the cops. TechnoPathology then claims that Scarlett's account lacks credibility because of inconsistencies between her accounts in her lawsuit, the Tortoise Media podcast, and the Lila Shapiro article. Now, normally I'd go on like a long diatribe about how memory degradation is normal and it's really common for little details to change over the years. I don't need to do that here because, with one exception, there aren't actually inconsistencies. And that exception is the fact that the Tortoise Media podcast didn't mention the presence of Gaiman's son in either Scarlett's or Caroline's accounts. TechnoPathology assumes that this is because Scarlett didn't mention it to them, but this presupposes that Scarlett has editorial control over the podcast. She obviously didn't. Any number of people could be responsible for that part of the story being omitted, and it has no bearing on credibility whatsoever. The other inconsistency is really just an artifact of technopathology's bad faith interpretation and poor media literacy. You see, so the incident where Gaiman assaulted Scarlett in front of his son took place in an Auckland hotel room about 2 weeks after they first met. There was the initial assault, and then Gaiman took her to the bathroom and did many horrible things. That's how she presents it in the lawsuit, the Tortoise Media podcast, and the Lila Shapiro article. Her presentation is very consistent. Unfortunately, Technopathology got confused when listening to the Tortoise Media podcast and concluded that multiple different allegations happened on the same night. It's remarkably stupid. Scarlett also alleged that at a different point in time, she and Gaiman were sitting on a couch, and the son was sitting between them, and he put his arm around both of them and started to grope her under her shirt. Technopathology responds like this.
This is not nearly as serious and would be a very easy issue to exaggerate.
Brother, do you think that this is an acceptable way to act in front of a child? And the rest of the article is just a litany of stomach-turning victim blaming that often criticizes Scarlett for failing to do things that she did. For example, take this excerpt from the Lila Shapiro article, quote, "On February 19th, 2022, Gaiman and his son spent the night at a hotel in Auckland. Gaiman asked Pavlovich if she could come by and watch the child for an hour so he could get a massage. When he returned, Gaiman and the boy ate dinner. Afterward, the boy sat against the wall by the picture window overlooking the city, facing the bed. Pavlovich perched on the edge of the mattress. Gaiman got onto the bed and pulled her so she was on her back. He lifted the covers up over them. She tried to signal to him with her eyes that he should stop. She mouthed, 'What the fuck are you doing?' She didn't want the child to overhear what she was saying. Gaiman ignored her and began to have sex with her, while continuing to speak with his son. 'You should really get off the iPad,' she recalls him saying. Pavlovich, in a state of shock, buried her head in her pillow." Here's how Technopathology critiques this.
Tried to signal with her eyes. In her account, she's facing away from him.
I mean, first of all, no, she wasn't. That's not true. But also, even if she was facing away from him, do you want to see something really nuts? Whoa. Oh my God. Have you ever seen such talent? Yeah, necks can turn. That's the point of them.
Would not a simple no suffice?
What the fuck are you doing is actually stronger than a simple no. That's like no plus. That didn't suffice. So it's safe to say that a simple no would not have done the trick either. Technopathology then cites some WhatsApp messages from before and after the assault that only serve to prove that she did, in fact, enter the hotel room that night under the circumstances that she recounted. That's the thing about Scarlett that you'll see in other pro-Gaiman content. We all talk about how it's necessary to believe in perfect victims, and Scarlett is a really good example as to why, because she did almost everything right. Like, she did everything that, like, a real victim is supposed to do. She told multiple people. She took pictures of herself clearly in distress immediately after the incidents. She kept evidence of her and Gaiman's communications. She went to the cops. She went to a psychiatric ward because of trauma. And yet these people act like she's lying unless she's proven otherwise. And when she proves them otherwise, they just ignore it. Technopathology also handwaves other examples of Gaiman exposing his child to this type of thing. He says that it's fine when Gaiman asked for a BJ in the kitchen when his son was in the house and likely to walk in on them. He ignores evidence of chronic inappropriate exposure. For instance, this is really disturbing. Gaiman insisted that Scarlett call him master, and he called her a slave, and he did this in front of his child so frequently that after about a week, his son started calling Scarlett slave, and also ordered her to call him, the son, master. That is extraordinarily disturbing. To brush this off as normal sexual behavior is genuinely unthinkable to me. The end of the article is just a summary of Technopathology's arguments. Let's respond.
Scarlett's accusations are a complete confusion. There are multiple accounts, some where the son is present, some where he is not.
Scarlett's testimony is extremely consistent. TechnoPathology just stupidly failed to recognize when Scarlett was talking about other incidents.
While it might be possible that the son was there, the more extreme elements honestly just seem made up for shock value.
You've heard of vibe coding? Let me present vibe journalism.
Why wouldn't she raise concerns with Amanda and the police at this stage if she thought that this was an unsafe or injurious situation?
She did. She told Amanda. There's a whole section in the article about it. There's really no reason that I can tell to believe that she didn't tell the police either. And once again, what people do and don't tell the police is not that indicative of anything, because police are often not trained in traumatic interviewing. Well, they are trained in traumatic interviewing in that they're trained in interviewing in the most traumatic way possible. And that's it for Scarlett. But what about Caroline Wallner, the former groundskeeper? Here are some excerpts from Lila Shapiro's article. Quote, once Wallner and the boy, then 4, fell asleep reading stories in Gaiman and Palmer's bed. Wallner woke up when Gaiman returned home. He got into bed with the son in the middle. Then he reached across the child to grab Wallner's hand and put it on his penis. And TechnoPathology responds,
what is even stranger is that the exact same pattern can be seen with another accuser, Caroline Wallner. There was no mention of a child in master, only later in There Is No Safe Word.
Let me remind you that Gaiman was going to kick Caroline out of her home if she stopped playing along. In his own words, you take care of me, I'll take care of you. But, what about after he evicted her, after she stopped playing along? Why wouldn't she tell the cops then? Well, that's when he paid her $275,000 to sign an NDA. Well, it's true that NDAs that seek to prevent people from speaking up about illegal acts are unenforceable. Gaiman is absolutely loaded. He could bankrupt her with a frivolous lawsuit for violating the NDA. And if you think that's a bad faith assumption, Gaiman is presently trying to do just that. In April of 2025, he sued Wallner for violating the NDA by speaking to Tortoise and Lila Shapiro. And I need to emphasize, he's not suing her for defamation. He's not saying that she lied. He's saying that she violated the agreement by speaking up at all. The reason why we haven't heard any updates is that the NDA has an arbitration clause, which is basically like an agreement to go to a private court for rich people. Sounds bad, and it is. But generally, arbitration is private, unlike most court cases. So we're unlikely to even hear about the disposition of this case. So yeah, when you give somebody a huge amount of money to sign an NDA and hold the threat of significant legal costs over them, if they break the silence, then they're probably going to stay silent. That's sort of the point. This neither impugns Caroline's credibility nor her character. And that's really all TechnoPathology has to say about Caroline Wallner. After the whole article, clumsily attempting to dissect Scarlett's story, we get a single paragraph about Wallner. What we don't get is exonerating evidence. This is just a stupider reinterpretation of the damning evidence that we already knew about. Next article.
The kink complication. BDSM has been conflated with something else in ways that could be discriminatory.
We start with a foreword. How literary.
When I wrote this article back in July 2025, it was based on my understanding on the case at that time. A lot of the content centers on Scarlett Pavlovich's about various kinky behaviors that she and Neil Gaiman engaged in. As time's gone on, and after analyzing the big differences between her earlier and later accounts, I've come to the conclusion that the more extreme kinky elements are simply made up for shock value.
Putting aside his conclusions, I don't know what the fuck he's talking about here. Aside from Scarlett's lawsuit, which obviously only covers her experience, the two main sources of victim testimony are the Tortoise podcast, which released in June of 2024, and Lila Shapiro's article that was released in 2025, with the latter being much, much more thorough, convincing, and horrifying. Although he failed to include much of the most damning evidence from Lila Shapiro's article, he included excerpts, so he had ostensibly read it. I'm honestly not sure what had changed. The overall point of this article is to refute the podcast portrayal of kink as being inherently non-consensual, which I agree. I really agree that the way that they handled the topic of BDSM is just bungled. Beyond the preposterous notion that somebody can't consent to being consensually hurt, I think just bringing BDSM to this at all is a mistake. It really feels like Tortoise recognized that what Gaiman did to Scarlett was profoundly wrong, but because of their baffling failure to recognize the dynamics of coercive control, they just saw her fawning text to Gaiman and thought, oh, well, gosh, what a quandary. So they kind of just whipped up this notion that all BDSM is non-consensual as a way to get across the wrongness of Gaiman's actions without reckoning with Scarlett placating him throughout their relationship. In reality, a victim being very sweet to a perpetrator after assault is actually very, very common. No matter how violent or overtly cruel a coercive relationship is, you will almost always find texts like Scarlett's. That's actually symptomatic of coercive control. So Tortoise's choice to demonize healthy BDSM practices is untrue and unacceptable stigmatization of a common form of human sexuality. And it's also a vestige of, frankly, their incompetence and intellectual laziness. They failed to handle this story properly. Fortunately, we have Lila Shapiro's article, by virtue of being more competent, avoided the weird anti-BDSM stuff while presenting the victim's allegations in a much more convincing light. So there's no need to go over this article. However, here is a funny error.
To top it all of, she's accusing Palmer and Gaiman of trafficking her.
Next up,
who is M?
This is all about Scarlett's friend Misma. She's the ceramicist. Caroline is also a ceramicist. I don't know. But she's the ceramicist whose partner was a lecturer in coercive control. And Misma is also the one who confronted Amanda for serving up this vulnerable person to a man that she knew or should have known to be a sexual predator. TechnoPathology has sort of hinted at this previously, but this part of his argument, which ends up playing a weirdly large role in his argument overall, is that these evil women, often older women, which he points out for some reason, convinced Scarlett to lie for some reason, or convinced her that her good experiences were actually bad. I guess we're just presupposing that Scarlett's fucking stupid, which is awesome. I'm not going to cover this article at all, really, for two reasons. One is that this theory is stupid even by technopathology's standards. It doesn't make sense on any level. It's not even worth lingering on. It's just nonsensical. I guess if you think that women are just conniving to take men down constantly, but I'm not a fucking misogynist, so I don't think that. The second reason why it's not worth covering is that Misma is a private person whose only crime was being there for a friend in a time of need. Technopathology really digs into her and her partner's background from his own position of comfortable anonymity. And I'm not going to aid in this creepy little exercise by further broadcasting this woman's personal details, especially when those details are irrelevant. And here are some of the worst writing errors.
One of the reasons that Gaiman wants a trial held in New Zealand is that will be easier. Misma directed Ouija board and also GOAT.
Next article.
Critical feminist jurisprudence and anti-Semitism. Questions arise about Paulette Benton Gregg's involvement. We also look at the wider political situation.
Paulette Benton Gregg is a New Zealandite feminist scholar who knew Scarlett personally and who spoke about her belief that Gaiman was grooming Scarlett in the Tortoise podcast. Are you thinking, an older woman? That's very suspicious. If so, then you're probably technopathology, and I want you to know that I hate you. Paulette is, of course, just another woman who supported Scarlett. This article is an attempt to refute Benton Gregg's claim that Scarlett was groomed. I'm not remotely interested in this. Our goal is to figure out what actually happened. Benton Gregg's relevance begins and ends at the fact that she's a third party to whom Scarlett disclosed her story not long after it happened. The details of how Benton Gregg interpreted Scarlett's experience has absolutely no bearing on the facts of what happened and whether or not her story is true.
This part is about the intellectual underpinning of Scarlett's case. It's not a typical essay case, but there are academics like Gregg who point out that not all crimes against women look how we would expect. Some can look like, to an outside observer, entirely normal relationships, with perfectly normal or kinky sex. Scarlett's case has all the hallmarks of pushing these non-standard definitions.
As I said earlier, this is actually a fairly typical SAA case. The perpetrator was somebody Scarlett knew, and it took place within the context of a coercive relationship. That's actually the norm. It's really wild to see technopathology act like it's uncommon for abusive relationships to look happy on the outside, when that's like almost always how these things happen. It's really a testimony to technopathology's ignorance about this subject. We then get a new claim. You see, technopathology has apparently read one of Benton Gregg's books about domestic abuse, and upon finding similarities between common abuse dynamics and Scarlett's experience, technopathology decides not that Scarlett's claims are similar to common abuse dynamics, but rather
there is a remarkably uncanny similarity between the sort of work that Gregg is doing and Scarlett's characterization of her time in Gaiman's employ, as well as the characterization that Misma holds. However, that does not mean to say that there is similarity as borne out by the WhatsApp messages. It looks more like Scarlett has continuously altered her narrative, or had it altered to look more in alignment with Greg's ideas.
After careful consultation with experts in the field, Scarlett has altered her account to align with the academic understanding of coercive control. I cannot think of a more clear example of confirmation bias. Remember this quote: "This is perhaps one of the most confounding aspects of domestic abuse. Whether an abuser is a cunning sociopath or a normal man afflicted by morbid jealousy, he will almost always end up using the same basic methods to dominate his partner." End quote. That Scarlett's experience aligns with the common pattern of coercive control is extremely standard. That's not a sign that there's some kind of cabal of evil old women who want to frame Neil Gaiman. What the hell? As this article goes on, the extent to which TechnoPathology thinks that outwardly happy relationships rarely hide abuse becomes clear.
It's a valid discussion to be had, identifying what appears to be a genuine issue in such trials. Despite all the romantic paraphernalia, the possibility that something violating occurred should never be dismissed outright. However, the idea is really run with in a very imprecise way that almost implies that all such going along should be equated to rape and abuse. This sort of notion is the one deployed in Master to explain how a relationship replete with gestures of love and affection, gifts and flirtation could actually be the site of abuse and extensive criminality.
I found this last sentence to be astounding. The fact that abusive man can perform these little effusive acts of love is so well established, so obvious. I honestly find it difficult to understand the perspective of somebody who doesn't already know this. You need to not watch movies about abuse, or read any books about it, or watch any TV shows about it, or know anyone who's experienced it. This is the guy that Neil Gaiman ordained to weigh in on this case. But good news, the next section of the article is all about coercive control, which is the heart of Scarlett's experience.
The law as it stands recognizes acts of violence, but does not address ongoing psychological terror, the pervasive threat that accompanies living with a dangerous partner, a terror that does not necessarily derive from physical force, but any number of punishments. For this reason, it's an invisible form of abuse, one that the wrong party has no legal recourse to, and one that is not deterred by the law, so continues unabated.
TechnoPathology then lists off some criteria for coercive control, presumably from Benton Greed's book, although it's hard to say because he never ever cites his sources. These include isolation, surveillance, gaslighting, economic abuse, threats and intimidation, and regulation of daily life. This is all true. Not all of these criteria need to be present, and they can manifest in different ways for something to be coercive control, but that is an accurate list. Before we get to the validity of the coercion argument section of this article, let's just go down our own checklist. As I said 3 hours ago, presumably, I don't think that the coercive control model is applicable or equally applicable to every accusation. Some of these, for example, like Julia Hobsbawm, was just pure predatory opportunism. Scarlett and Caroline Wallner are the most clear-cut examples of coercive control, so we will be focusing on them. However, I bring up the other accusations insofar as they're relevant to establish a pattern of behavior. So let's go down the list. 1, isolation. Definitely. Scarlett was alienated from her family, and Gaiman and Palmer had hired her to essentially move to Waiheke Island and away from her social support system. This is just how a nanny job works, and I'm not arguing that this is an inherently abusive isolation tactic. However, I think it's telling that Gaiman has a pattern of trying to fuck women once they become isolated, Caroline Wallner after her husband left. Likewise with Kendra Stout, the woman that Gaiman allegedly assaulted during a vacation in the Cornish countryside in 2007. This happened when she was far from home, far from social support. 2, surveillance. This was present to some degree for both Scarlett and Caroline Wallner, just by virtue of being Gaiman's employees and living on his weird island and his creepy forest mansion, respectively. Both women lacked privacy to a profound degree. Both recall that doors were rarely closed or locked. Caroline Wallner recalls finding it impossible to avoid Gaiman because he just frequently barged into her living space without warning or permission. 3, gaslighting. There's really not enough detail about their day-to-day communication to remark on that one in sufficient depth. 4, economic abuse. Absolutely. It's meaningful that he saved the most protracted and vicious abuse for women who are utterly financially dependent upon him. Both Scarlett and Caroline were terrified of disrupting their relationship with Gaiman for fear of becoming homeless. Gaiman outright told Caroline that her housing was dependent on her performing for him with "you take care of me, I'll take care of you." And don't forget, Scarlett begged Amanda Palmer to promise that she would get to keep her job before she told Amanda about what had happened. 5, threats and intimidation. Again, he was threatening to evict Caroline if she didn't gratify him. And when she stopped gratifying him, he evicted her. With Scarlett, there was not only the threat of homelessness, but Gaiman would visit unspeakable punishments on her when she wouldn't do exactly what he'd say. And 6, regulation of daily life. Although we can glean certain bits about the control that he exerted over Scarlett and Caroline in the day-to-day, there's really not enough information for me to feel comfortable talking about this in any depth. So we have 6 areas of coercive control and 4 that we haven't... Oh my god. Why? And 4 that we have enough information to really talk about. Gaiman's behavior fits those 4 criteria very neatly, but let's see what this least expert man on Earth has to say.
Gaiman did not threaten or hit Scarlett, and neither were the hallmarks of coercive IPV present.
Well, Gaiman did hit Scarlett, and as we just established, the hallmarks of coercive control were present. Throughout the coercive control section, Technopathology refers to coercive control as IPV, aka interpersonal violence, aka domestic violence. As we've already discussed, the situation that Scarlett and Caroline experienced is different from the standard DV situation, but it's still coercive control. All IPV is coercive control, but not all coercive control is IPV or DV. Analyzing Gaiman's behavior as interpersonal violence would be like analyzing the North Korean prison guards' behavior as interpersonal violence.
Classic or typical IPV is often understood to characterize a honeymoon phase, where the victim is lured in over months, thinking they found the perfect partner. The abusive partner becomes more controlling over time and takes more steps to isolate the victim.
Well, you see, there really wasn't a honeymoon phase in that prison camp, so therefore, there was no coercive control present. Technopathology then argues that Scarlett wasn't actually isolated because she could physically leave the island if she wanted to, and she wasn't cut off from contact from everyone she knew, which is interesting coming from a man who was just looking at this through the lens of domestic violence. With few exceptions, every single victim of domestic violence can physically leave the house. It's just that they know that if they do that, they will be at risk for homelessness or retaliation, exactly like Scarlett. Regarding the financial control, Technopathology's argument is incoherent, both logically and grammatically.
Being broke and penniless, whether substantially true or not, was not due to Gaiman's actions. Incidentally, Gaiman wants financial records to be presented as evidence in a court case. She had an amount of money if she could afford to get on and off the island.
How can she claim to be broke? She had an amount of money. How many amounts of money does getting an apartment in New Zealand cost?
I mean, it's 1 banana, Michael. What could it cost?
An amount of money.
We also get...
She neglects to say that she had no other residence or job because she had voluntarily dispensed with them, rather than because Gaiman or Palmer had prevented her from continuing with them. She was already dissatisfied with her economic situation, so she would have had her own motivations for dispensing with them.
This is what the great writer Neil Gaiman sees as the last bastion of journalism. I get the gist of what he's saying, but there's so many floating thems and weird syntactual choices that, I don't even know how to respond. Rewrite this and come back later. And finally,
there are no threats of genuine punishment. There are no actual orders that don't clearly pertain to kinky roleplay. He is not even withholding money to ensure obedience, but offering it, even later when he can't see her face to face and has little to gain.
It is not kinky roleplay if it's non-consensual. Do they teach British schoolboys how to use commas? Do they just give them lead poisoning and then just ask them to guess? For the record, Gaiman and Palmer were withholding money. Scarlett didn't get a penny from her nanny until weeks later. In one of the post-Gaiman boosting the blog articles that I'm not going to cover, well, I guess I am covering it right now, Technopathology leaks some financial documents claiming to prove that Scarlett was paid, and they don't actually contain any proof of her receiving payments. They just contain them talking about paying her. So I'm going to assume that the claim that she did not get paid until weeks later was true. And the last part of this is truly delusional. He offered money even when he had little to gain. Gaiman offered money in exchange for Scarlett signing a backdated, all-encompassing NDA. That is not an act of altruism. So after more baseless conspiracy about Pauline Grieg tricking Scarlett into feeling abused, we get to the anti-Semitism part of Technopathology's argument. Gaiman's family had Jewish ancestry, although they converted to Scientology. But, still, that is meaningful. Technopathology's argument boils down to it plays into anti-Semitic conspiracies to claim that a Jewish man committed sex crimes. Technopathology is fully acting like accusing Gaiman of assaulting women is part of like a blood libel conspiracy theory. This is where he takes one of his proportionally few shots at Lila Shapiro by claiming that this cover is anti-Semitic. And for those listening, it's just a picture of Neil Gaiman. According to Technopathology, once you see it, it's hard to unsee. This is just a picture of Neil Gaiman. I feel crazy. I feel like Technopathology is drawing a connection between this normal picture of a man and the scheming Jew image that Nazis love, which is ironically an incredibly anti-Semitic thing to do. The rest of this article is discussing, to which Technopathology, that just means mentioning, instances of wrongful convictions against black men and the judicial system not believing people of color. This does not apply to Neil Gaiman, who is a wealthy white man. Next up.
Was Scarlett gagged? Is the problem NDAs, or is the misuse of them for secret settlement contracts, as the Can't Buy My Silence campaign says? And which is this, a standard clause or a secret gagging order?
First of all, that is a grotesque title, given that some of Scarlett's accusations entail violent gagging. That's like when Vera from Council of Geeks used a fucking flogger as a prop in her Neil Gaiman video. What is wrong with you people?
In the sense that, you know what I mean? Like, when I'm saying that...
Technopathology's point is that NDAs aren't inherently bad, and they're standard for many jobs. Which is true. I sign NDAs for every case I take, for every client I have, just to preserve confidentiality. The problem here lies not with the fact that an NDA exists or even the terms of the NDA that Scarlett signed. It's that Gaiman asked her to sign a backdated NDA immediately after learning that Scarlett was going to Me Too him. He also argues that this isn't an NDA, but rather an independent contractor agreement with a confidentiality clause, which is technically true, but technically untrue too. It is effectively, functionally, an NDA. In the context in which Gaiman imposed it was clearly intended to silence Scarlett. The worst writing errors of this one are...
But there are also very standard NDAs which are in almost all employment contracts standard. If it were an attempt to prevent Scarlett from speaking out, this would be pretty sloppy.
Next article.
Personal reflections. It's been a journey.
Shocking news, Technopathology feels bad for Neil Gaiman. Yeah, it's really heartbreaking, isn't it? This obscenely wealthy man is being accused of assault and his wife left him. He's the true victim. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. What about the other allegations? After the initial love-in in the bathtub, Scarlett moves in. She makes a number of allegations about what happened while she stayed with Neil Gaiman.
Let's temporarily enter a whole other reality where there is reasonable doubt as to whether the bathtub incident was consensual. Would it be appropriate to call an encounter that one of the parties claims was unconsensual a love-in? Like, that just shows a concerning degree of comfort with even the specter of sexual violence. Regardless, this is addressing the numerous and absolutely horrifying allegations throughout Scarlett's legal complaint. So I feel like Technopathology has been dressing sniveling, pompous, incompetent essay apologia as journalism till now, and I feel like this is really when he shows the type of man that he really is. Despite the fact that Technopathology litigates all of the sordid details about what Scarlett endured, but also sorts the claims by type of essay, I'm going to cut out all of the explicit content. It seems, to put it lightly, extremely disrespectful for Scarlett and all of the victims of SA to air her experiences in such painful detail. I get that Technopathology doesn't think that it actually happened, but I do, and I care about giving people dignity. So Technopathology starts with a portion of Scarlett's lawsuit that details just a brutal attack. Quote, Scarlett screamed, "I can't," and "no" at the start of the encounter, and continued to scream in pain through the entire encounter. Technopathology responds,
February 14th is Valentine's Day. 4 days before she told him in WhatsApp messages she was at his service and a bit of a greedy girl. He can't see her immediately. She is practically begging him to see her.
Bro, fuck you, dude. Like, this is so fucking sick. This is so sick. Acting like consenting 4 days in advance makes her screaming no invalid. He then claims that Scarlett was lying about this because she rode on a ride at a fair like a couple of days after the attack.
How does someone get redacted so hard that they are screaming in pain one day, and yet a few days later they are at the fun fair riding the Dodgems? Jesus Christ.
This makes me feel actually sick. TechnoPathology finds it suspicious when Scarlett tried to pretend like she was okay because she didn't want to seem upset. Yet TechnoPathology also found it suspicious when Scarlett checked herself into a psych ward. There's nothing she could have done. There's no behavior that TechnoPathology would have found acceptable. That's all this article is. It's creating this indefinable, insubstantial object of this ideal victim, like a woman whose behavior we cannot define, and yet whose absence renders all real victims liars. We don't get exonerating evidence. We don't get novel analysis. We don't even get good writing. This is just the same old bullshit that we've ever heard any creepy piece of shit use to excuse SA. The worst errors from this article are:
for such a person, it's fundamental shattering of the way the world is supposed to work. There's always been a sense that you makes yourself a target if one goes against the crowd. But if anger is misdirected, ignorant, or blind, it could be just become another form of harshness. The rather extraordinary claim undermines the notion that these events happened at all, which, as noted, happens rarely, and then is not an indicator in itself that it was unconsensual.
Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Did Rachel Johnson censor my article?
No. Next article.
Now Pedro Pascal is being targeted. Breaking. The bigot brigade is turning on its money tap, paying off influencers to spout rubbish and deepfakes that trans ally Pedro Pascal is creepy.
This is not relevant. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The Johnson family hypocrisy. Caroline Noakes has been sexually harassed and given the cold shoulder for complaining. Why does Rachel Johnson go after Neil Gaiman rather than speak up about her father's spot of bother?
Now, this is also relevant. I hate Rachel Johnson. She is a bigot. I'm not surprised that her family is full of perverts. But here's the thing about hypocrisy. It doesn't mean that someone's wrong. A person can be a hypocrite and still be right. This doesn't speak to the merit of the victim's claims. All this serves to do is bolster the argument that Rachel Johnson is only going after Gaiman because he's a trans ally, which seems doubtful given that Gaiman wasn't that outspoken. Why wouldn't they go after an actual trans person? There are plenty other powerful British men who are trans allies and also don't have these accusations. And also, they would have just gone after a trans person. That would be way more politically useful to create this like serial assaulter trans person to hold up whenever anyone second guesses their psychopathic bathroom bans. The overall gist of this article is talking about how Rachel Johnson has a history of excusing powerful men who have also committed assault. And if anything, this explains a lot of the choices they made in the Tortoise Media podcast. This is coming from somebody who doesn't know much about or take this type of violence very seriously. And maybe Rachel Johnson just hated Neil Gaiman, which is why she singled him out as the abuser rather than other abusers. This is a lot like the appeal to hypocrisy in that it doesn't actually address the core truth of the case. Let's say Rachel Johnson was so appalled by Gaiman's flaccid, virtue-signaling pseudo-activism that she decided to dig up dirt on him. That dirt is still there. And also, again, Lila's Shapiro article exists and it's way more thorough and it came to the same conclusions. And Shapiro does way more pro-trans work than Gaiman ever has. The worst error is
she now see it as a duty, an absolute duty.
Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The Nazi Turf Alliance. Press releases were sent out on the day of the accusation's publication. The recipients are a who's who of right-wing culture warriors, TERFs, and embittered conservative pariahs. But it gets worse.
Exact same deal here. Yes, TERFs are right-wing psychopaths who will come for abortion in the UK. Mark my words. Yes, Rachel Johnson is a piece of shit. This isn't relevant. I can only assume that the goal here was to blast you with examples of horrible people, to bias you against the Tortoise Media podcast, and hope that you forget about the Lila Shapiro article, and also transmute that bias onto the testimony of the victims. This article is kind of interesting in that it has this very unstable vibe to it. It's primarily screenshots of hateful Kiwi Farms and 4chan posts reveling in Gaiman's downfall. The presence of opportunistic bigots, while horrible, it's just inevitable online. And it just doesn't have any bearing on the truth of the accusations. TechnoPathology doesn't seem to get that, and he really burrows in here. There are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of screenshots of hateful anons and 4chan. There are so many screenshots that when you paste this into Google Docs, it is 137 pages long. And you can really see the cognitive bias working in his donkey brain. He's just seeing oh, hateful screenshot and being whoa, yeah. And it's you're not proving anything. I'm aware that 4chan is full of Nazis. That's what it does. That's its whole deal. What are you trying to tell me? Why are you putting so much of this in here? Fortunately, we are not so stupid, so we can move on.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Racial hoaxes and anti-Semitic tropes.
So this is apparently the best that TechnoPathology has to attack the Lila Shapiro article. We already did this a little bit before. It made me deeply uncomfortable because of its latent anti-Semitism. So he analyzes the cover of the issue of New York Magazine that published this article. The cover, again, it's just a picture of Neil Gaiman. I will put it up on screen. I took the liberty of censoring all of the slurs in this post, but please know that TechnoPathology did not. So he just published a picture of Neil Gaiman with a bunch of anti-Semitic slurs on it. So that's cool. He's sort of in an orange light, but it's pretty in line with his other professional portraits. In this article, we get TechnoPathology, and I truly hate to say this, but pointing out how Jewish Neil Gaiman looks here. The last time I mentioned this, I said it seemed like TechnoPathology was comparing this normal picture of Gaiman to the greedy Jew image, and unfortunately, we get direct confirmation of this here. TechnoPathology actually edited the magazine cover by superimposing the screenshot of anti-Semitic 4chan hate speech and the greedy Jew image onto the picture of Gaiman's face. He also added, and I'm so sorry for this.
Hook nose, check. Beady eyes, check. Hunched over, check.
One thing people don't tell you about being bald is that when you have hair and you flush or you blush, your cheeks become red, and nobody knows that their entire head's also becoming red because they have hair. But when you're bald, your entire skull it just turns red. He also changed the title of this from
"Call Me Master"
to
"Call Me Jewish." You've gotta be.
This is anti-Semitism. Oh my god, it's insane, dude. It is insane. This is the last bastion of journalism that Neil Gaiman promised would exonerate him. We also get this AI generated picture of a stereotypically queer-coded woman pointing and laughing at a sad-looking Neil Gaiman with what I assume is a Nazi and also a man in a business suit who I guess has two left arms. Okay, next article. Jesus Christ.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Caroline Wallner, leverage in a real estate deal, litigation, arbitration.
Caroline Wallner's story is a big hurdle for TechnoPathology to overcome. The extreme power balance of the relationship, the similarities between her position and Scarlett's position in that both of their housing was at risk, and, most damning of all, really, the $275,000 settlement. That's a lot of money. TechnoPathology summarizes Caroline Wallner's story like this.
Several years before Master, ceramicist Caroline Wallner had a consensual relationship with Neil Gaiman following her breakup with husband Philip Marshall. She lived on Neil's property in Hudson Valley, New York State. However, for various reasons, her relationship with others at the time was souring, and she was asked to leave. She had been staying there rent-free and was given a further 7 months to find a new place. During this time, she began to accuse Neil Gaiman of exploitation and sexual abuse, which eventually culminated in her contracting Gloria Allred's legal firm, which secured her a $300,000 settlement and made all parties, Wallner, her former husband, and Neil Gaiman, sign an NDA, promising not to publicly discuss the relationship, issues surrounding real estate that had arisen, or litigating against anyone involved.
Although the general arc isn't inaccurate, it's missing a lot. The relationship was consensual at first, but it stopped being that way. That's how consent works. You can revoke it. After a certain point, she only engaged in this intimacy because she was afraid of losing her house. She wasn't asked to leave for various reasons. She was asked to leave because she stopped agreeing to have phone sex with Neil Gaiman. And she wasn't staying rent-free. She was working as a groundskeeper, and housing was just part of the employment. This is where we get the first appearance of a trusted source. TechnoPathology will cite this trusted source with firsthand knowledge a whole lot. We never learn who this person is. He mentions that Igor Goldkind was friends with Gaiman. Can you imagine if he was the source?
So whatever people saying, don't you let them dick your soul around.
This is where the fact that this is a Substack blog from an anonymous loser becomes a problem. It's not uncommon for journalists to cite anonymous sources. However, in doing so, they're relying on their professional credibility. And I'm fine taking anonymous sources if I trust the journalist. TechnoPathology, again, is some anonymous asshole with a blog. There's nothing wrong with citizen journalism as long as the citizen is transparent about their sources. They can't rely on this professional credibility that they haven't cultivated. So the second that some random guy cites, just trust me, bro, as a source, we have a problem. First, I don't trust him. I don't trust his judgment. I don't trust the sources he trusts. He put Igor Goldkind in here.
Waves are your faces, curved towards you.
And second, I'm concerned about who's feeding him this information and what their motive might be. Is it an impartial third party? Is this Gaiman's lawyer? Is this Neil Gaiman? Is it Igor Goldkind? I can't...
Hiding behind your hand job smile.
All I can say is that he hasn't given me any reason to trust the truthfulness or the unbiasedness of this third party. That said, according to TechnoPathology,
a trusted source states that the whole argument between Gaiman and Wallner has nothing to do with sexual impropriety and everything to do with real estate. That essentially Wallner was not holding up her end of the bargain in terms of pitching in, was getting on the wrong side of others involved in the property, and that Amanda wanted her to move out. The essence of the problem is this, states the source. Wallner and her family were already getting a good deal by not having to pay rent in an extremely expensive part of the country, the Hudson Valley. There was originally a promise that they'd get some of the land, but that would no doubt involve Philip Marshall's construction skills. He divorced Wallner in 2017, so couldn't follow through. Meanwhile, Wallner slipped into depression and didn't contribute much to work on the property. She did continue to make and sell her ceramics to celebrities and upscale art galleries.
Yes, we promised you land, but we promised you your land when you were married and you're divorced. Without your husband, I just don't think that you can build a cabin, baby. This is so misogynistic. What of the, $275,000 in exchange for signing an NDA? Well, TechnoPathology claims that neither Gaiman nor his lawyer proposed an NDA. That was actually Caroline's lawyer's idea. To support this baffling claim, TechnoPathology gestures to a Wall Street Journal podcast about Caroline's lawyer, Gloria Allred. I'm sure you've heard that name before. TechnoPathology did not really enumerate how that supports his claim, so I went and listened to the podcast in full, and nowhere does it say that Allred proposed this NDA. I'm pretty sure how he came to this conclusion is the Wall Street Journal podcast is talking about how Gloria Allred's law firm gets their clients to agree to a confidentiality agreement with the firm, not with the clients. I think TechnoPathology might have just mixed those up because he's, he uses this stupid and baseless assertion to spin off this alternate explanation for the massive settlement payment. And his explanation is it was a swift conclusion to a lawsuit that was about real estate. I find this very implausible. Flashbacks to 1L, but real estate is one of those things where you almost always need written contracts to enforce due to the statute of frauds. I just got fear shivers down my spine. TechnoPathology argues that Gaiman, being a wealthy man, paid the settlement partly for the ease of avoiding a trial. However, Gaiman is currently suing Caroline for violating the NDA, an NDA that is statutorily unenforceable. If this man wanted to avoid a frivolous lawsuit, then he wouldn't currently be conducting a frivolous lawsuit. TechnoPathology goes on to quibble about the difference between a court ruling and arbitration. Hilariously, he quotes a statement from Caroline's new lawyer that it's uncommon for abusers to sue for breach of an NDA when their victims speak out because the optics are so bad, which is true. Gaiman suing Caroline looks really bad. TechnoPathology refutes this by saying,
"This is a strange thing to say because whether or not there is any substantial truth to the allegations, of course at this stage Gaiman cannot silence Wallner. The horse has bolted, so to speak? Could it be that he acts different from the abusive men because he is not, in fact, an abusive man?
It's an interesting theory. Suing somebody for breaching an NDA meant to silence claims of abuse looks so guilty, so abusive, and so outright abusers refuse to do it, that the fact that Gaiman is willing to do this transparently abusive thing is evidence of his innocence. Interesting. And for the record, again, he's not suing for defamation. He is suing for breach of contract. As for trying to discredit Caroline, he doesn't even have fawning text messages like he did with Scarlett. He just writes alternate universe fanfic.
When he says, "I like our trade," she wants us to understand that he means a trade of sex for housing. But would that be the obvious interpretation if it were not for her framing? What if trading care for care? Not a romantic relationship, but just one where they look after each other's emotions, help each other out.
What if they traded Digimon cards? And he was referring to that. Really makes you think. Okay, well, baby boy, what he meant is clear from context, okay? You can't just remove a statement from context, invent new context, and then just pretend like you made a point. Earlier, we talked about how Gaiman initiated the contact when his child was sleeping between him and Wallner. Caroline recounted this in both the Tortoise Media podcast, the Lila Shapiro article. Here's an excerpt from the Shapiro article, quote, "Sometimes she would babysit once Wallner and the boy, then four, fell asleep reading stories in Gaiman and Palmer's bed. Wallner woke up when Gaiman returned home. He got into bed with his son in the middle. He then reached across the child to grab Wallner's hand and put it on his." TechnoPathology responds,
"Quite sordid, but did that actually happen? Because funnily enough, when she's describing the same incident..."
Then he puts up an excerpt from the Tortoise podcast, quote, "Caroline says this goes on for almost 2 years. Sometimes she would say no, sometimes she wouldn't go to him. She recalls one incident where she fell asleep reading a story. When I woke up, Neil was in bed, and he put my hand on his." TechnoPathology responds,
"Where is the sun? You would think this would be notable. And if such an important detail has been inserted or removed, how can we trust the rest of it?" The exact same pattern is seen with Scarlett. In her original allegations in Master, she describes kinky scenes in an Auckland hotel room. There is no mention of Gaiman's son. Later in Shapiro's article, describing the same event, suddenly a child appears.
Looking at this, a smart person would wonder, why did Tortoise omit the details about the child? TechnoPathology wonders, why did this child suddenly appear later on? This is so obviously an editorial choice. This is not an inconsistency. Neither Scarlett nor Caroline had editorial control over that podcast. The rest of this article is just half-baked speculation about why Caroline would lie, and that's insulting to her. And it's also insulting to me because it assumes that I'm brain dead enough to entertain such notions. The next article is a summary of everything he's written so far that we're skipping because, unfortunately, I read everything in full. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The WhatsApps. Written messages detail the entire relationship. Read them and find out for yourself.
This is just a link to a court listener download of 44 pages of WhatsApp messages that were entered as evidence into Scarlett's lawsuit. I read all of them. I'd imagine that TechnoPathology didn't pick out the ones where Scarlett was at her most fawning, because he already has in other articles so many times. All of this is recognizable if you're familiar with DV or coercive control dynamics. Yeah. It provides no meaningful insight beyond just the fact that Neil Gaiman is emotionally manipulative, which, shocker. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Kendra Stout. She's known and loved Neil Gaiman for 17 years. So what happened?
As a refresher, Stout and Neil Gaiman met at Gaiman's book signing when Kendra was 18 and he was 43. She was a fan and they exchanged contact info, which again, lawful but awful. For a few years, they had sort of a BDSM relationship that Kendra herself claimed to be consensual. The Tortoise Media podcast claims that she couldn't consent to be harmed through BDSM, which is insane and I absolutely will not entertain. Pertinent here is that in 2007, they took a vacation to Cornwall. On the vacation, Kendra got a horrible UTI. She said she couldn't sit down, it hurt so bad. She made it clear to Gaiman that she could not have intercourse, and he forced it. Her significant portion of this article is about Kendra's online activity as a teenager and as a young adult. She posts a lot of fan comics about Gaiman, which we knew she was a fan. TechnoPathology posts a bunch of pictures of her dressed raunchily. Yeah. These pictures could not be more irrelevant, and frankly, I kind of have to wonder whether these are here to portray her as a slut. Finally, near the bottom of the article, TechnoPathology gets into the actual relevant instance of SA. He starts by implying that Kendra was lying when she talked about going to the police in 2024. He believes she's lying because he couldn't find the police records, which is normal for anything involving abuse.
Usually the police will make a statement, but none has been forthcoming.
No, they usually don't make a statement about, again, cases involving SA. It's about victims' privacy. It's generally a pretty big priority here. Not that it even matters, as we saw with Scarlett. There's a reason why victims generally don't go to the cops. Anyway, TechnoPathology finds reasons to disbelieve Scarlett because
the narrative about something happening in a cottage in Cornwall came later after she had been convinced that Neil Gaiman had victimized Scarlett Pavlovich.
Really, the only response that TechnoPathology has to Kendra's allegations about the Cornwall trip, there's no debate whether the two were there together in the house that night. I'm not seeing any refutation, counterpoint, or counter-argument about this assault. Really, TechnoPathology's argument rests on Kendra's explanation about why she came out about the assault now. She essentially says that after Me Too gave her a more complex understanding of the power disparity in the relationship in general, and also just like the complex dynamics of abuse, she came to recognize that night in Cornwall for what it was, and she hadn't recognized it beforehand because, they still stayed together for a little bit afterward, and it's just more difficult to recognize SA in the context of an intimate relationship. Especially, this was in 2007, so really the social understanding, the narrative about how this happened was like stranger in an alleyway. I find this quite understandable. People expect that after they're assaulted, they will realize the gravity of what happened immediately, and that's just not true. In fact, Kendra's experience with taking a long time to recognize what happened to her is the norm. As I already mentioned, I think a meta-analysis found that 60% of women who had been SA'd via force, threats, or incapacity, aka situations where consent was unambiguously absent, didn't recognize that their experience falls under the definition of rape. Study found that 75% of people who contacted a rape crisis center in the UK were looking for support for an assault that occurred over a year prior. So yeah, the notion that Kendra only came to recognize what happened to her as SA after Me Too gave her a more thorough understanding of what SA looks like, that makes a lot of sense. That's not what TechnoPathology thinks, obviously. Kendra mentions the power dynamic. Kendra mentions that part of her evolving understanding in light of E2 was recognizing that the power dynamic between her and Gaiman was kind of screwed up. She was really young and a fan, and he was an old, powerful man. TechnoPathology, in line with his habit of forgetting what words mean when they don't serve his argument, takes this to mean that Kendra believes that she was assaulted because of the age gap and the power disparity. It would be bizarre if she said that, but she didn't. She said that it was a gross age gap and she was assaulted. And even if this characterization of Kendra's reasoning was correct, so what? If a person repeatedly says no, and that the pain would be excruciating, and the other person forces a sexual encounter, that is assault. Regardless of how Kendra arrived at that conclusion, the facts still stand. That conclusion would still be correct. But TechnoPathology is unable to actually dispute the core facts of Kendra's story. He spends all of this time criticizing her, second-guessing her motives, scrutinizing her character. He, in my opinion, brings up that she was an inspiring actor in a way that frames it as, suspicious. I believe implying that she brought up the accusation for attention to give her career a boost, which, how many times have you heard people say that about an SA victim? 1,000,000 times, and it's always stupid. She's doing it to get famous is a statement that is both as old and as stupid as a rock. As if getting harassed by Neil Gaiman's fans gives her career a huge boost in the acting industry. TechnoPathology also bafflingly argues that it's improbable that Gaiman would commit SA because he has a good reputation.
Nobody close to him or who worked with him, nobody around believed he was anything but a courteous, appropriate, highly safe person.
I think, for one thing, all of the people that were close to him who are now accusing him of SA would disagree with this statement. What are you even talking about? Also, it's cruel to keep these commas just to torture them. Either kill them or let them go. And that's basically the end of the article. I want to pause and really appreciate how significant TechnoPathology's failure to address the substance of Kendra's rape allegation is. Her story is very cut and dry. She repeatedly said no. He didn't listen, he forced himself on her. TechnoPathology presents no evidence to dispute this. He provides no evidence that she's lying. He doesn't even really offer a cogent counter-narrative. He says that Kendra wants to be famous, but he's not willing to outright say that she's lying for clout. He says that Kendra recontextualized her understanding of what happened, but he doesn't actually dispute what happened. This is a very serious allegation, and the fact that he's comfortable just kind of half disputing it and then just dropping it is genuinely disturbing. He shows a level of comfort with the possibility that Gaiman physically forced himself on a partner who is saying no that makes me question whether he thinks that assault within a relationship is a big deal at all. If he did think that was a big deal, I don't understand why he'd be willing to claim that Gaiman is innocent without meaningfully disputing what he did to Kendra that night. Okay, next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Case dismissed. The case against Neil Gaiman has been thrown out of court. Now the real work begins.
This refers to Scarlett's essay and trafficking case. It's true that it was dismissed, however, it was dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. TechnoPathology makes much hay about this, but this judgment has no bearing on the actual substance of the claims. So basically everything that she's alleging happened in New Zealand. She is suing in Wisconsin, which is where Amanda Palmer and sometimes Neil Gaiman live. Generally, courts only have jurisdiction to rule on things that happened in their region. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions aren't necessarily present here. To quote the judgment directly, quote, all of the relevant events occurred in New Zealand. Pavlovich is a New Zealand citizen. Both parties were living in New Zealand during the relevant time. All relevant evidence and most potential witnesses are located in New Zealand. Under these circumstances, it is clear that New Zealand is a more appropriate forum for resolving the dispute, so the court will dismiss the case without prejudice, which means that you can refile later. Continuing the quote, if Pavlovich sues Gaiman in New Zealand and he refuses to accept service there, Pavlovich may move to reopen the case. So not only did it dismiss it on procedural grounds without prejudice, but it's actually leaving the door open quite explicitly for her to refile in Wisconsin. Also, Scarlett just had an appeal, and I think they just recently had oral arguments. Regardless, our goal is to evaluate the substantive facts. This is a procedural discussion. It's not relevant to the question of what happened, any of the questions that we're trying to answer, really. So we're going to move on. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The messages his accuser doesn't want you to see. Thanks to another sharp-eyed investigator, further messages detailing Kendra Stout's relationship to Neil Gaiman have been uncovered.
I'm not making any allegations, but do you remember during Depp versus Heard, where Depp's lawyers would leak the information to pro-Depp influencers? I don't know.
Remember in the previous post where I mentioned that Kendra Stout had scrubbed her live journal and that the messages detailing her relationship to Neil Gaiman could only be accessed by the Wayback Machine? That archive only went up to 2005. Recently, another investigator contacted me saying that they accessed the live journal on the Bing archive, which is no longer available due to the discontinuation of the service. They did manage to save it before it was taken down. This is real and authentic, has been confirmed by someone who read this live journal for years and remembers reading these sorts of posts from Kendra.
First, delete that comment. Second, we have another trust me bro, but it's even worse. It's not even like someone confirmed they saw these posts on her blog. It's someone confirmed they read her blog and she would post this type of thing. All from an anonymous Substack blog. We have anonymous weirdos vouching for anonymous weirdos vouching for anonymous weirdos. Of note, TechnoPathology only shows us selections of this archived blog. We're getting cherry-picked snippets of a blog that we know is the right blog because somebody who read Kendra's actual blog said that she posted stuff like this. This shit would not fly if TechnoPathology was a real journalist, but fine, let's take a look, whatever. He could be real and he's just incompetent. You never know. This post is from a little under 2 months after Kendra's trip to Cornwall where the assault happened. Quote, I am trying so hard. Dear LiveJournal, I am trying to be a good girlfriend. I know that is not usually one of my known attributes, LiveJournal. Pretty much the opposite, actually, but I am trying. I'm a clinger by nature. I'm also needy and selfish and obnoxious when I don't get my way. I am not a good thing to be dating, but I am really, really, really trying to at least be less of those things and more the nice girlfriend things, like supportive and understanding and sweet. Mostly I am failing, but my point is, I am trying so hard and usually I don't try. Usually when things get hard or when I become such an unbearable bitch that I don't even want to be around me anymore, I just break up with the guy and wander off, not too worse for wear. But this time I'm trying to be better because this is the big one, and it's so important to me. I can't let it not work. What can we confirm from this entry? Well, we already knew that Kendra didn't think of what happened in Cornwall as assault until years later, so the fact that she doesn't recognize what happened as assault here is... it was already a given. We already knew that. But regardless of, whether you label something that happened, the pain is still there, right? And Kendra seems like she's in a lot of pain here. There's a lot of self-hate throughout this letter. I am needy and selfish and obnoxious when I become such an unbearable bitch. I'm not a good thing to be dating. This is not somebody who seems like they're in a healthy relationship to me. I mean, people can come up with self-hate and insecurities even in good relationships, but this does not reveal a happy relationship, that's for sure. Remember what I said about how coercive control works? You make your target's life frightening and unpredictable, and then you establish yourself as the sole means of finding comfort. This seems like a frightened woman who is trying desperately to find comfort in her relationship with Gaiman. Kendra's live journal entry is not proof of coercive control on its own, but it fits. Let's see what TechnoPathology has to say about it.
There is no recrimination about Neil crossing boundaries, sex abuse, or the like. In fact, she is lamenting the various ways she might be making life difficult for him, the ways she might be clingy, selfish, or obnoxious, and be trying hard to improve. She believes that Neil Gaiman is the one, which does not square well with the idea of someone who has recently traumatized her.
Bro, this behavior is so common among abuse victims. I've known women who've married guys after they've assaulted them. Trauma is confusing and complex, and if you don't understand how this works, this is a big part of why I'm doing this. The experience that Kendra had of trying even harder to hold on to an abusive partner after a traumatic event is so common, and TechnoPathology is spreading very dangerous misinformation about it. If you're one of the many people who share this experience with Kendra, I can imagine reading this drivel and questioning your own understanding of what happened to you. This argument that says that staying with him and calling him the one is inconsistent with the victim could so easily burrow into a person's mind like a tick and just infect their ability to face the fact that their partner is hurting them. So back to Kendra. The other snippets of her post are really similar to this. They're full of longing for Gaiman and this powerful and nebulous sadness. They don't talk about any interactions between her and Gaiman with any specificity. So that emotional vibe is really all that they have to offer us here. An emotional vibe that TechnoPathology himself calls
very candid outpouring of grief and self-recrimination.
So to summarize, going into this, we already knew that Kendra did not initially recognize what happened was assault. These excerpts show us that she was full of self-blame and that her relationship with Gaiman was turbulent immediately following the assault. And TechnoPathology wants us to view this as being incompatible with Kendra being abused. It's insulting. It's truly a brain-dead argument. It is untouched by any of the empirical data or research about victim responses to SA. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent, and it gets weirder. Julia Hobsbawm is the 5th accuser. Did you know that she and Masters Rachel Johnson have a relationship going back decades? Pull back the lid on the deception and bloody writers feud.
This is about Julia Hobsbawm. Her last name is hard to say, so I'm just going to call her Julia. So as a refresher, Julia was one of Gaiman's industry colleagues back in the 80s when he was starting his journalistic career. At one point, she invited him to her apartment. According to her, they had a strictly professional relationship with zero sexual romantic history. Once they were inside of her apartment, Gaiman suddenly pinned her on the couch and began aggressively kissing her, and she wriggled out of his grasp and then fled. And they never spoke again. As you can tell from this title, this one is all about some, nefarious, nebulous conspiracy between Julia and Rachel Johnson, aka Boris Johnson's sister and the co-host of the podcast.
Rachel Johnson and Julia Hobsbawm are, in fact, firm friends who collaborate closely on PR and journalism projects through Editorial Intelligence, Hobsbawm's networking company, now bankrupt. Often compared to a private LinkedIn for elites, offering introductions, luncheons, curated pitch reports, and invite-only conferences for a hefty fee. In simple terms, these are the people who decide what the news is.
Okay, so you can either clown on Julia for running a bankrupt flop company, or you can claim that she's a power broker. You cannot do both.
Now bankrupt. These are the people who decide what the news is.
This first part of the article details various social, professional connections between Rachel Johnson, Julia, and other TERFs. The goal, of course, is to claim or at least imply that Julia made up her story as part of a TERF push to take down Neil Gaiman, of all people. As if by sometimes being trans-inclusive, he's some sort of outspoken activist threatening their agenda. And again, it would be so much more useful for them to have an actual trans person with a history of sexual violence to point out and be like, see, they're all violent. Like, this just doesn't even make any sense as a tactic. But hey, I'm trans, and if there's good evidence of this weird collusion, I'm I'm all ears. I identify as female to ears.
That the lead journalist on this investigation happens to know one of the 5 accusers and has not mentioned or explained this fact whatsoever is a serious and profound departure from neutral, disinterested, transparent journalism. In case there was any confusion, let me put it this way. If in the course of this investigation about Neil Gaiman, I suddenly brought up Barry, my best friend from high school, who just so happens to have known Neil Gaiman for years, if I interviewed Barry and presented this as evidence of my claims, would this not raise questions? How could it not?
As TechnoPathology would have pointed out, if he were a competent thinker, wealthy Brits seem to live in like a rarefied, nepotistic social bubble, especially when these are wealthy Brits who work in journalism and publishing. Remember, Gaiman was briefly a journalist in the 1980s, and that's how he met Julia, so it's not like these two random people just happen to know each other by sheer coincidence. These are two wealthy people who come from privilege, who worked in the same field on an island together. Them knowing each other isn't surprising in the slightest. Rich people network like crazy.
Despite uncovering huge amounts of concerning facts about this case, it was not until I started researching Julia Hobsbawm that I discovered the close connections between her and Rachel Johnson, and the further relationships to the prominent TERFs and far-right forces within the media establishment. Now that I know, it makes sense of a profound unease that I felt from the first moment I listened to those initial allegations in Master. In that strange, manipulative, and poorly argued podcast, there were so many journalistic sleights of hand, so much ducking and diving, so many elements that scream of ulterior motives. It's probably the main reason this entire series exists, because all of these people are connected. In the wake of the allegations, many TERFs and their fellow travelers used it as an opportunity to attack not only Gaiman, but many other figures on the left.
The really funny thing is that TechnoPathology obviously has no problem connecting Rachel Johnson with transphobia, but he struggles to connect Neil Gaiman with trans people in any meaningful way. So we get this like string chart of Neil Gaiman being friends with a trans activist and Julie Bindel hating that activist and Rachel Johnson being friends with Julie Bindel. It's ridiculous. Think about it like this. Boiling it down, we have 5 known accusers. 1 of them is British, 3 are American, and 1 is from New Zealand. The fact that the British one who met Gaiman because they both worked in the same field also knew one of the journalists working the podcast means that all 5 of these allegations were fabricated? How on earth did they pull that off? The TechnoPathology makes repeated references towards powerful older women getting younger victims to recontextualize consensual experiences into non-consensual ones. I personally don't believe that all these women are stupid, so I struggle to see how somebody could coach them so successfully. Also, what are the connection between these evil older women? With the exception of Julia, none of them and none of their friends know Rachel Johnson. What stake do they have in TERF UK politics? And even then, what about the corroborating third parties? What about Amanda Palmer's musician friend who was there during the conversation between Palmer and Gaiman, wherein Gaiman confirmed that his child was present without headphones on during one of his attacks on Scarlett? What about him? That guy wasn't even in the Tortoise Media podcast. And for that matter, like, what about Lila Shapiro as a whole? Her article was way more thorough, way more damning, and it didn't fall into the weird puritanical pearl clutching thing that Tortoise podcast did. Oh, I'm sorry, am I not supposed to say that Gen Z is puritanical because it makes the Puritans look bad? Sorry. Imagine defending Calvinists.
And yet, it appears as if Lila Shapiro was lined up for the New York Magazine/Vulture article many months before. She's even mentioned suspiciously in John Del Erosa's videos about the initial allegations, despite her having no public link to the Gaiman case at that time. No reason is given.
Okay, so what do you mean that he suspiciously mentioned Lila Shapiro?
You guys got to remember Josh Whedon, right? I've reached my monthly article limit. Jeez, of course this happens right here.
What do you mean no reason is given? This chud was comparing Gaiman, a vocal male feminist, to another vocal male feminist, Joss Whedon, though he called him Josh Whedon, which is funny. Lila Shapiro wrote the investigative article on the allegations against Joss Whedon.
Sparkle, sparkle.
This guy doesn't even mention her by name. He just pulls up her article. This is just showing that Shapiro has a history of critical investigative pieces into prominent men who commit misconduct. This is perhaps the least suspicious thing imaginable.
Whether Lila Shapiro is a gun for hire under the sway of the PR industry, it's already a question worth pondering. A trusted source disclosed that There Is No Safe Word was heavily influenced by Deanie von Muffling, Amanda Palmer's PR guru, who famously repped for Monica Lewinsky.
First of all, don't act like repping Monica Lewinsky's a bad thing. Second of all, someone should tell your trusted source that Shapiro's article made Palmer look fucking terrible. What PR rep would write an article that frames their client as either knowingly or recklessly feeding vulnerable young women to her vile ex-husband? What type of PR is that exactly?
For many, Shapiro's article marked the moment they accepted the allegations against Neil Gaiman. Here, the message came from a respected LGBT journalist in a prominent New York magazine, rather than from the mouths of TERFs operating out of a grimy internet basement. But given this overwhelming potential for behind-the-scenes manipulation, we should question the apparent authorities Shapiro's rubber stamp bestows.
Rubber stamp? This article is like 10,000 words long. It's very thorough. This is the best way to explain away Lila Shapiro's article? Like, are you kidding me? You people said that there was going to be exonerating evidence, and what you're giving me some right-winger talking about Joss Whedon? Are you kidding me? Inept. Okay, next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. J.K. Rowling's Dark Money, Kink Hatred, and the Secret Influence of Julie Bindel. A deadly campaign against trans folk and their allies is being waged by Julie Bindel and J.K. Rowling. What connection does this have to smearing of staunch trans ally Neil Gaiman?
You already told us about your stupid theory. I don't need more screenshots of J.K. Rowling tweeting mean things about trans people. We are not going over this again. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The accusers are poor-mouthing. Claims of economic dependence significantly shape how we see these accusations. It's a way to dismiss the consistent evidence of consent. They had no real choice. One problem. They aren't poor.
This is actually the first article I read when I first saw the blog. I was scrolling through it and I was like, poor-mouthing? What is poor-mouthing? Well, it's apparently an archaic way to accuse someone of pretending to be poor when they're not. And let me tell you, this article, it was an accurate introduction to technopathology. But, it wasn't a flattering introduction to technopathology. The takeaway that I got from this article is just like, wow, this guy does not understand, language. The first half of the article is accusing Scarlett of not actually being desperate for money by invoking a deep and frankly possibly willful misunderstanding of what family estrangement is. It's really wild to see. So he talks about how Scarlett's family is wealthy and digs up posts from her personal blog from when she was extremely young, early teens. And it is basically like, how can a girl from a wealthy family who seems so happy on her blog secretly be abused? And the answer is what do you mean? This is so normal for child abuse that it frankly verges on the mundane. He also goes after Caroline Wallner in equally stupid ways.
She has 3 daughters, who by the time she started making allegations were college-aged. They all were sent to liberal arts colleges, which must have been expensive, but it wasn't something Wallner had to do, so feasibly that money would have been available for her own use. Oh my god.
It's called FAFSA, you stupid Brit.
She was, of course, living there on the estate for 6 years rent-free. She also had a ceramic studio there in the barn. Was she just an ordinary artist, trying to get noticed? Well, no. She actually sold the ceramics to a large variety of wealthy and famous patrons, including long-term friend Michael Stipe, lead singer of R.E.M. In fact, this 2023 Milan exhibition was presented by both of them. I
can't believe I have to say this, but time is chronological. Someone having a successful art show in 2023 does not mean that they had that money in 2022. I haven't even mentioned this now because it's just so stupid, but Technopathology repeatedly mentions R.E.M. singer Michael Stipe. I didn't know that Michael Stipe was gay until just now when I looked up his picture and saw that he had a septum ring. So hello to my bald gay brother. Because apparently he's a fan of Caroline's pottery and they seem to know each other to some extent. Technopathology repeatedly makes the argument.
Couldn't she live in one of Stipe's houses in Athens? Would it even be possible to pressure someone who had access to these sorts of options?
Okay, knowing somebody and asking somebody to live in their house are two very different things. Yeah, R.E.M. singer Michael Stipe has a lot of resources, but it would be foolish to assume that a person being rich is the same thing as a person being generous. Neil Gaiman paid his nanny $14 an hour. I mean, particularly in such an intimate way, in an I can live with you way. We don't know how well these two even knew each other. We just knew that they knew each other. And that's That's it for this article. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent, Claire. She is the only one of the women who can genuinely claim economic disadvantage, and she's got relatively little attention compared to the others. So who is she and what happened?
I just want to reiterate that TechnoPathology posted a bunch of pictures of Scarlett from an article about homelessness in New Zealand, but sure. Claire was originally the pseudonym for Catherine Kendall. To refresh, because it's probably been 1,000 hours since I first mentioned her story, Catherine was a fan of Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer. She met Palmer after a show. She was going to volunteer at a book signing with Gaiman, and Catherine asked Palmer whether she'd like to pass a message to Gaiman. According to Catherine, Palmer, quote, put her arms around my neck and whispered, "Hello, Neil," into my ear, and said that I had permission to nibble his earlobe and he's British. Ugh. So Catherine then at least hugged Gaiman, and he kissed her on the cheek twice, and he invited her to numerous after parties where he'd show her a lot of attention and do some very flirting type stuff. On their way home, somebody was giving a bunch of people a ride, including Catherine and Gaiman, and she ended up on his lap at one point, and he started to feel her up, and before he struggled with her lingerie and gave up. In her words, quote, "That was kind of the theme. I just submitted to it, not because I wanted to, but because it was Neil Gaiman. He was touching me, he was close to me, I was in his orbit," end quote. After the car ride, she briefly ended up in his hotel room where he kissed her and felt her up. She froze and didn't really reciprocate, and he eventually stopped. After that, he sent a very love-bombing email. She was a fan and was excited to be talking to him, so she told him that she enjoyed the sexual experience. They corresponded over the phone and via text. He would alternate between effusively praising her and being, frankly, kind of mean and demeaning, particularly if she didn't play along with his romantic advances. During this e-crush/e-friendship, Catherine made it very clear to Gaiman that she was not interested in sleeping with him. There are numerous conversations between Catherine and her boyfriend where she says that Gaiman is not interested in sleeping with her. In one such example, she says that Gaiman didn't want sex, which she was excited about, and she says that sex with Gaiman would be extremely gross and she would be ashamed of it. At one point, Catherine tried to de-escalate the lecherous behavior, telling Gaiman that she was out of her depth and she wanted to move to shallow water. Shortly after this request, Gaiman escalated his sexual advances. Still, the next day, Catherine emailed him saying that she enjoyed it and got off on the call. He invited her to a tour stop in Nashville, which she had mixed feelings about. She nonetheless attended because, mixed feelings are not necessarily exclusively bad feelings. But when she attended, the second they were alone, Gaiman started kissing her. She recalled him kissing her and repeatedly groping her ass, and she would move his hands away and he would move them back. Gaiman asked Catherine and her friends to wait in his van, and he got them drunk. Catherine told her friends that she was starting to get scared, and they came up with a hand signal that she could use if she needed help. When Gaiman finally was done with the book signing and book reading, he came back to the tour bus and patted his lap for Catherine to sit down, and she did the hand signal, the help hand signal, but her drunk friends didn't notice. Gaiman then took her to the back of the bus, pushed her down, and started kissing and groping her. She says she panicked and froze, preventing her from playing along. Catherine alleges that Gaiman kept saying shit like, "Kiss me like you mean it," and "Kiss me like you'll never see me again." Catherine believes that Gaiman recognized that she was not reciprocating and said that "kiss me like you'll never see me again" as a kind of an implicit threat, knowing that she was a huge fan and, they had a friendship and she would be heartbroken if her hero never spoke to her again. She recalls feeling foggy, her arms feeling heavy, and Gaiman eventually rolling off of her and saying, quote, "I am a very wealthy man and I'm used to getting what I want." She didn't respond to this, so he said, quote, "I'm really sad because I think I'm going to let you go." Again, Neil Gaiman doesn't really deny any of these events. He says that he invited her thinking that she would be down to fuck. He initiated the intimate contact and then he stopped after realizing that she didn't want it. And I know we went over this earlier, but just to reiterate, there is contemporaneous text records of this. Catherine was texting her boyfriend throughout the encounter. At 7:14 p.m., she texted her boyfriend, quote, "I'm having a lot of fun. I shouldn't have dreaded this so much." Half an hour later, she texted, quote, "So out of my comfort zone and there's nothing I can do about it." Less than half an hour after that, she texted, "I'm safe with my friends." And then 39 minutes later, she sent a text saying, "I need to leave." Her boyfriend hadn't responded to any of this at this point, and so at 9:36 p.m., she sarcastically wrote, quote, "Wasn't sexually assaulted much, or extremely harassed, or touched too inappropriately. I'm an idiot for thinking I could just be friends with Neil Gaiman." The next day, she wrote in her diary, quote, "When I hung out with Neil, I was really uncomfortable. When we were in the bus together, he pressured me. I think I was sexually assaulted." Years later, Catherine confronted Gaiman about what he did in a series of phone calls that she recorded, and after that, he wrote her a check for $60,000. So within an 8-month period, Neil Gaiman was paying 3 different women significant sums of money after they all respectively accused him of assault. All of these cases are well documented and well supported, but Catherine's is particularly striking. The recorded phone call, the text from that night, the journal entry from the next day, it's more evidence than a large share of assault cases ever get. Let's see what TechnoPathology says about it. The overall gist of his argument is that Catherine is lying when she claims to not be sexually attracted to Gaiman in the Tortoise Media podcast. I will concede that I think that Tortoise Media did not construe her story very well, given that they also did this with Scarlett, and that it's not really in the victim's best interest, and it's not really how they represent their own stories when they're talking outside of the podcast. I really do think it's on Tortoise, but I do feel like Tortoise really sort of downplayed the level to which at certain points she was engaging with Gaiman. I think they saw that as somehow diminishing her case, which it doesn't. But that said, I don't really find the evidence that Catherine is lying when she says that she wasn't attracted to Gaiman to be very compelling. I mean, for one thing, her behavior strikes me as a young person who is starstruck and flattered by the attention of a celeb.
The friend who had organized the book signing messages to tell Catherine that Neil really likes her, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that this was like in a quite clearly romantic/sexual way.
This is inaccurate. The friend said that Gaiman, quote, adored her, which strikes me as even more ambiguous than like, which is already pretty ambiguous. And again, why does this matter? Catherine was upfront about being flattered by his advances. Her only contention was that she became increasingly uncomfortable with the sexual interactions, and that Gaiman didn't shut it down when she asked him to. Much of this article is quibbling over whether Catherine was aware that Gaiman was interested in her, and whether she liked him back. All of the article up until the Nashville section isn't really disputing what Catherine said. She is aware that she told Gaiman that she liked the car groping incident. She is aware that she was giddy about their relationship. Technopathology is shadowboxing against like this hysterical, dogmatic feminist who claims that every power imbalance is assault. And I don't know where that woman is, but she's not here. Let's jump to the substantive part of the article, aka Nashville.
I need to say for the record that I have extensive interviews that contradict Claire's account of this night, but I am choosing not to release them yet. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. They will be released at some point, but I suggest that even with sticking with what is currently publicly available, wrongdoing on Gaiman's part is far from clear.
Extensive interviews with whom? Could it be your unnamed source with personal knowledge about the case? Given that the only people there were Catherine, Gaiman, and her friends, and Catherine herself said that her friends just were drunk and didn't notice when she was doing the hand signal, and therefore probably wouldn't be great eyewitnesses. I just have to wonder who your source is. I just have to wonder. I just know that if I believed that somebody was falsely accused and I truly had convincing evidence to exonerate them, I would consider it unethical to withhold that evidence. So let's see how TechnoPathology refutes the evidence that actually exists. He starts with Catherine's text to her boyfriend.
According to Master, at 7:14 p.m., she texts her boyfriend, "I'm having a lot of fun." And "I shouldn't have dreaded this so much." Physical affection, she mentions, began from the moment she arrived.
This is not what she said. In the screenshot TechnoPathology put right above this, Catherine said, quote, "When we got to Nashville, the second we were alone, he started making out with me. The moment they were alone, not the moment they arrived." I guess when you can't criticize what someone claimed, you can always just alter what they said and criticize that, huh?
9:36 p.m. So out of my comfort zone, and there's nothing I can do about it. This seems, again, quite a strange thing to text your boyfriend when you've gone to meet another man and have been kissing him all night. Nothing she can do about it? Nothing?
Take note, ladies, if you don't immediately pepper spray somebody and run out of the room screaming, then you don't have a claim to be assaulted. The main gist of TechnoPathology's argument is this.
The bottom line is when he realizes she's not into it, he stops. She was giving him the impression she was, or indeed actually was interested in sex that night. She's asked to spend the night, kissed, had phone sex, but now she doesn't seem like she wants to. But even if he did say something like this in a moment of frustration, the main point to take away is he did not press on after the point he realized she was not comfortable. He rolls off of her, puts little distance between them, unprompted.
This argument only works if you ignore most of the details of the night itself. Yes, Gaiman had reason to believe that she might want to hook up. However, he also had a lot of reason to believe that she might not. This might be controversial, but I actually don't think that consent always needs to be verbal to count. I mean, I'm gay, and applying the verbal affirmative standard means that like pretty much all cruising is inherently rape, and it's not. It's just not. And I don't think it's a special carve out either. Anyone who's been sexually active for long enough knows that just nonverbal consent is just a thing. It just is. People like TechnoPathology will use that to their advantage. However, they will never confront that For us to recognize the validity of nonverbal consent, we also need to recognize the validity of nonverbal non-consent. People like this act like you can non-verbally give consent, but you cannot non-verbally withdraw consent, and that's not how this works. So really, to evaluate this, we need to look at the behavior of both parties and the social context in which it happened, and then determine whether one party could reasonably believe that the other party gave consent. And I recognize that nonverbal communication is often more ambiguous than verbal communication, and any nonverbal communication runs a much higher risk of going unnoticed, particularly if the other party is neurodivergent, as Gaiman is. I'm willing to accept if there's a gray area where one party reasonably believes that consent was present and one party reasonably believes that consent was absent based on nonverbal cues. I am open to that. However, looking at the behavior and the context of the night in Nashville, I do not believe that a reasonable person could have thought that Catherine was consenting. I don't think that's what Gaiman thought either. And in this case, the fact that Gaiman eventually stopped is not enough to exonerate him. The fact that a sexual assault did not become a rape does not mean that it's not an assault to begin with. Catherine had expressed desire to Gaiman in the past, and if this was like a typical sexual relationship, I wouldn't have that much to say about Gaiman assuming that she wanted to make out to begin with. You know, like I can reasonably expect that I can come home and kiss my husband and that he'll be okay with it, right? However, in the lead up to Nashville, Gaiman had to repeatedly reassure Catherine that he did not want to sleep with her. We can't pretend like this is a relationship where it's fair to presuppose consent. So even if Gaiman was incapable of interpreting the body language, which he's not, he lacked a sufficient basis upon which to conclude that Catherine wanted to sleep with him. I can't believe I didn't mention this when I was originally filming, but her repeatedly taking his hands from off of her body and then him repeatedly putting them back is perhaps one of the most unambiguous examples of nonverbal non-consent that I can think of, short of her slapping him in the face. This is not an ambiguous facial expression or body language that's difficult to pick up on. This is very direct and physical communication that no reasonable person, neurodivergent or not, could mistake for anything but an expression of non-consent. And that Gaiman persisted in putting his hands back on her body is, to me, an acknowledgement of that consent and a display of disregard for it. Or, really, he could be showing that he does care about consent, but in a negative way. He cares about the absence of consent. And that's just to start with. As the night progressed, the absence of consent becomes more and more stark. I think that the detail of Catherine telling her friends that she was scared is very chilling and telling. I've got plenty of criticisms for The Gift of Fear, but it's very applicable here. She had come in thinking that he was her friend. You don't start feeling afraid of your friends for no reason. TechnoPathology addresses this by, surprise, surprise, forgetting that words mean things.
Before she's spoken about scared and nervousness and excitement more or less interchangeably, and however she was feeling, she came there voluntarily and chose to stay.
First of all, TechnoPathology used the wrong type of there. He used plural possessive, which is literally a mistake that you were supposed to stop making in elementary school, and he's done this so many times. I literally just don't bring it up every time he does it. You'll notice that I stopped bringing up grammatical errors. There are too many of them. I stopped mentioning how many times he misused it's because it's just too much to count. Secondly, regardless of whether she used scared to describe ambivalent excitement in the past, she's clearly not doing that here. What does this argument even mean? Are you saying that maybe she liked it despite claiming she didn't? Or are you saying that she's a little baby who doesn't understand her own feelings? Either way, it sounds pretty misogynistic. The rest of this argument is the same selective inability to understand words. For example, Catherine describes freezing as he was on top of her. He's sort of badgering her to pretend like she's into it by saying, "Kiss me like you mean it," and the like. She says, quote, my arms felt really heavy and everything was foggy, and I must not have been pretending enough because he rolled off of me. TechnoPathology responds,
how exactly would Neil Gaiman know if she was pretending? Why pretend if you believe someone knows that you are pretending?
She wasn't pretending. That's the thing. That's the thing that she wasn't doing. He was essentially pressuring her to pretend. Kiss me like you mean it. That's what she's referring to. She wasn't kissing him like he meant it. That's why he rolled off. And when subtle threats didn't work, he rolled off of her and said, I'm a very wealthy man and I'm used to getting what I want. And then I'm really sad because I think I'm going to have to let you go. That's coercive, dude. That's fucked up. He is showing clear recognition of her lack of consent And he is trying to override that with threats. That is not what a normal person does after they realize that somebody doesn't want to fuck them. That is not what some bumbling goof who doesn't understand body language does. That's sure as shit not what somebody who really cares about consent does either. As to the "I'm a very wealthy man" quote, TechnoPathology says,
"My sources express skepticism about the 'I'm a very wealthy man' quote. They say it's just not how he speaks or thinks."
Oh, your unnamed sources with an unnamed relationship with Neil Gaiman, whose supposed interviews you've still failed to release, told you that Gaiman didn't think like that. Okay, how convincing. People are well known for acting the exact same in every situation. Regarding Catherine writing about being essayed in her diary, TechnoPathology says,
"Did she? Or is it more likely she wrote that in later when she wanted to tell a different version of events?"
First of all, you need a question mark if you're going to ask a question. Second, no, it is not more likely that she wanted to tell a different version of the event later. Her having a completely unknown, inexplicable, nefarious motive is way more unlikely than her writing in her diary at the time. That's it for the actual essay. TechnoPathology then moves to the phone call where Gaiman paid her off. He started by saying,
"Catherine recorded a phone call with Neil Gaiman without his consent, which is a crime in many U.S. states with up to 1 year in jail time."
Okay, well, I know that it is for a fact not a crime in the state that Catherine is in. Why would you even bring this up? Homosexuality is legal in Chechnya. Like, should I bring that up every time I talk about my husband? Or would that be a complete fucking non sequitur? Jesus Christ. Throughout this section, TechnoPathology pulls up sections of the call in which Gaiman is saying, in essence, "Well, I don't remember that, but I'm so sorry I made you feel that way." And TechnoPathology is praising Gaiman for his empathy. TechnoPathology attributes the settlement as an act of generosity from the same man that pays his nannies near minimum wage when he pays them at all. The rest of this article is covering the phone call with Gaiman. It's just half-baked linguistic analysis wherein TechnoPathology relies on, and I'm not even kidding, ChatGPT. We don't get any substance. After more mind-numbing repetition of the same 5 dog shit arguments, the article ends. And we've officially finished covering the substance of all 5 current accusers. We have officially 0 exonerating evidence for any of them. And I just said that I stopped posting my favorite grammatical errors, but here are my favorite from this article.
So does she stop it? Not really. She is almost putting the expectation on Neil to put the brakes on while driving forward at full speed herself. Brakes is spelled brakes. What is a someone supposed to do if not this?
Next article.
9 reasons to keep reading Neil Gaiman. No one can tell you what not to read.
It's just a critique of a different article about Gaiman. It presents nothing new. This one is only notable in that it was clearly written by AI, and as a result is a numbered list with a bunch of bullet points and is littered with emojis. He also calls Gaiman the OG trans ally, which pissed me off real good. Next,
4 reasons to watch Coraline this Christmas. Good tidings we bring.
This one is really funny because, Coraline is not a holiday movie at all, in any sense of the word. So the first hurdle he has to get over is why this list exists. And his first point is just, 1, it's okay to watch a Halloween movie for Christmas, which is, I guess. Thank you. Slop. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. A New Year's recap. 5 months of revelation later, we are a little bit closer to the truth. Here's a 10-point summary of everything discovered last year.
This is obviously just a retread of what we've already seen, as if this weren't repetitive enough already. I was going to do a flyover of this list, but it's just so deeply repetitive that would just mean repeating a lot of the stupid, vile shit he spreads about victims, and so I'm not interested in doing that. Next.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. The evidence revisited. Come to your own conclusions.
More repetition, another retread. How many recaps do you need? Nothing new is presented. We can skip.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. Introduction.
I don't know why this is here. It's just like a self-indulgent recounting of how TechnoPathology came to defend Gaiman. If this was at the beginning of the blog, I might have been interested to look inside this man's mind, but by now I've seen enough. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent, a guide to the claimants. The only concise guide to exist on this subject to exist after a year's worth of reporting by the mainstream media.
And that is a writing error in the subheader to do the entire article. Another index/summary, no new information, no evidence. Also, claimants is not the right word. Currently, only Scarlett is affirmatively suing Gaiman. I think Caroline's counterclaiming, but either way, that's 2 out of 5. I guess accusers paints a overly accurate portrait. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is innocent. TechnoPathology, a victim of censorship.
No. Next article.
Neil Gaiman is Innocent, A Guide to the Investigation, is the size of a book. So let me give you an overview.
Don't worry, baby boy. This is what this video is for. This article presents no new evidence. Next.
Neil Gaiman is Innocent, Paula Gosney's article. Even in articles coming out today, basic factual errors persist, as well as just really bizarre violations of common sense. Am I the only one creeped out by concept creep?
Another response to a different article wherein no new evidence emerges. Next.
Neil Gaiman is Innocent, The Contract. Scarlett Pavlovich says she signed an NDA that bound her to silence regarding her relationship with Neil Gaiman. This is logically impossible.
This is the last one before our cutoff date when Gaiman first posted this blog. I'm excited that this is the last one we have to really address because I know a thing or two about contract law. This is the first point TechnoPathology argues regarding Scarlett's NDA.
It does indeed contain a non-disclosure agreement, clause 7.1. However, this does not mean that it was intended to silence her regarding the relationship. The claim is that this document, which Gaiman has made publicly available via court listener, is a legal tool intended to prevent Pavlovich from talking about the relationship. I'm going to show how this is not just nonsensical, but logically impossible.
The logical impossibility that TechnoPathology speaks of is that Scarlett said that she didn't read the entire contract, but still claims that the NDA silenced her. The exact wording from the Tortoise podcast was, quote, she says she didn't even read it because she doesn't understand legal stuff. So 2 points. 1, not reading something at the moment doesn't mean that you didn't read it later. And 2, she could skim it and see a section titled Confidentiality and get the picture. What's clear is that she ultimately knew that an NDA restrained her speech. Remember, she ended up in contact with Zelda Perkins, who's an activist whose entire thing is fighting against abuse of NDAs. This part of the argument is so stupid that you need like a tautology to disprove it. We know that Scarlett knew about the NDA from the fact that Scarlett knew about the NDA. The TechnoPathology's next argument is a real legal monstrosity. He's saying that the relationship was never confidential. TechnoPathology cites an excerpt of the confidentiality agreement that says, quote, the contractor agrees to maintain strict confidentiality with respect to the services and duties performed for the company. The contractor will not disclose, and the contractor will use her best endeavors to protect against the disclosure of confidential information to any person, firm, corporation, or entity, any information acquired through the company, including but not limited to ... And then TechnoPathology cuts off there. Then he asks,
what is confidential information? In legalese, it simply means secret, known only to a few private parties and intended to remain that way. At the stage when the contract is signed on 25th of May, 2022, the number of parties who know about the relationship include Gaiman, Palmer, and Pavlovich herself, but also Wayne Muller, Ms. McKay Anaru, her boyfriend Chris, Paulette Benton Gregg, a variety of others living on the island named in passing or just as neighbors.
So he concludes,
so it should be very obvious that this contract cannot legally bind someone to confidentiality on a subject that is not, nor ever has been, confidential, nor was requested to be confidential, nor intended to be confidential, or any measures taken whatsoever by Gaiman or his representatives to make it confidential. Without tracking down and securing the separate agreement of everyone who knows about the consensual relationship, you cannot make something secret that is not secret.
He then claims that because this information was already known to third parties and therefore not a secret, then the contract would fall under something called the doctrine of impossibility. I find it difficult to overstate how legally incorrect this is. The confidence to say this stupid is admirable. So what TechnoPathology is trying to do is create a half-wit's definition of confidentiality equating to secret when we don't need to do that. The contract makes the definitions of confidentiality very clear. So let's read the entire confidentiality provision. Starting again at the beginning, the contractor agrees to maintain strict confidentiality with respect to the services and duties performed for the company. The contractor will not disclose, and the contractor will use her best endeavors to protect against the disclosure of confidential information to any person, firm, corporation, or entity of any information acquired through the company, including but not limited to trade information, forms and documents, products, services, the identities of current, past, and prospective customers, financial information, intellectual property, and any information concerning Neil Gaiman, including without limitation information relating to his business associates, business entities, partnerships, and trust with which they are affiliated, his and his family's characteristics, customs, views, opinions, ideas, conduct, habits, purchases, shopping preferences / habits, personal database / contacts, photographs and videotapes, travel itineraries, social / family interactions, tax information and phone calls, and any other information, both during the terms of the agreement and after its termination. So despite TechnoPathology's attempt to redefine confidential information as secrets, What it really means is that big long list of pretty much everything that Scarlett experienced during her employment and afterwards. This is the most straightforward, obvious, intuitive reading of the contract. Also, it's true that the NDA is backdated to the beginning of Scarlett's employment, and she had already disclosed what had happened to several people by the time she signed it. However, this is an argument about legal enforceability. That is not the point. NDAs that are designed to stop people from talking about illegal activity are inherently unenforceable. The subject of enforceability does not matter here. What matters is that the NDA was used to silence Scarlett, a non-lawyer who did not understand the details of its terms, from speaking about what happened. The mere presence of an NDA is effective in doing that. And even if the enforceability of something so obviously designed to silence a victim mattered, TechnoPathology's argument is a deeply embarrassing misunderstanding of the law. Assuming that the court found that the backdating was valid, that would mean that Gaiman would be able to sue Scarlett for breach of contract because she disclosed after the official beginning of the term of the contract. This absolutely does not invoke the doctrine of impossibility. Jesus Christ, that is not what that means. That is not what the doctrine of impossibility is. That doctrine is exclusively effective for when an unforeseeable event renders performance of a contract impossible after the contract was signed. That's like if you contract me to to fill a swimming pool with concrete, and then an asteroid hits your yard and hollows it out. It was an unforeseeable event that rendered doing the thing I was contracted to do impossible, and so I could use that doctrine to get out of performance. Scarlett disclosing confidential information that is not only foreseeable, but it is the thing that the contract is designed to prevent. It is not a unforeseeable event. This is not on the table here. This does not make any sense to invoke. This is just an idiot thinking, oh, this is impossible, and then looking up legal impossible, and then using this doctrine without actually reading about it because he is either too stupid or too incurious to do any research. God only knows, maybe he has ChatGPT. I wouldn't be surprised. He cites ChatGPT numerous times throughout all these articles. I just didn't bring it up every time. If I talk about every time he does something unthinkably stupid, this video would be 20 hours long. The only thing that he has proved here is that he knows too little to provide insight, and he is too stupid to do any research. And finally, here are the funniest grammatical errors from this article.
Another run-in with Scarlett Pavlovich's lawyers on Blue Sky has prompted me to return to the cloying issue of her supposed NDA. Law Sky, particularly Pavlovich's lawyers, singular possessive, and their plural possessive associates.
As I mentioned, that is the last article before the February 5th cutoff that I'm providing for us. However, I do just want to talk about some of the shit he's been posting just to dunk on it, because at this point, we can conclude Gaiman is full of shit. There was nothing exonerating there. There was absolutely nothing. And think of all those grammatical errors. I was kind of marveling at how bad a musician Igor Goldkind was to my friend Marty. And I was like, wow, I can't believe that Igor and Gaiman are personal friends. And he pointed out, I bet this is the most talented friend that Gaiman has left. I bet that this is the most talented journalist who is willing to go to bat for Gaiman. And he can barely write. He genuinely does not know the difference between it's and its. He frequently misuses there, and there. I would not dunk on a normal person for this to this extent, but he says that he has been a journalist of 20 years. You need to know basic grammatical literacy. What? Look at the shit he's been posting. There's a ton of AI in it. Look at an article about trauma with this AI slop woman screaming with broken glass. Insane. An article called Scarlett Pavlovich seemed genuinely happy. Previously unpublished images and videos, where it's just her goofing around with Gaiman's son. And there were 5 pictures too. It was like they had a fun day together. It's just so fucking stupid. It is so stupid. I don't even know what to say about this. So let's reread Gaiman's Instagram post about this. The one that brought us here. This is what he said. And again, excluding the part of this that's just an ad for this new shitty book. It's been a while since I posted anything anywhere, but I didn't want to let any more time go by without thanking everyone for all your kind messages of support over the last year and a half. I've learned firsthand how effective a smear campaign can be, so to be clear, the allegations against me are completely and simply untrue. There are emails, text messages, and video evidence that flatly contradict them. These allegations, especially the really salacious ones, have been spread and amplified by people who seemed a lot more interested in outrage and getting clicks on headlines rather than whether things had actually happened or not, parentheses, they didn't. One thing that's kept me going through all this madness is the conviction that the truth would eventually come out. I expected that when the allegations were first made, there would be journalism, and the journalism would take the mounds of evidence into account, and was astonished to see how much of the reporting was simply an echo chamber, and how actual evidence was dismissed or ignored. I was a journalist once, and I have enormous respect for journalists, so I've been hugely heartened by the meticulous fact and evidence-based investigative writing. The meticulous fact and evidence-based investigative writing of one particular journalist, whom some of you recently brought to my attention, who writes under the name TechnoPathology. I've had no contact with TechnoPathology, but I'd like to thank them personally for actually looking at the evidence and reporting what they have found, which is not what anyone else had done. If you're curious about what they've uncovered so far, the clickable link in my bio takes you to really good investigative reporting. And then it's a fucking ad for his shitty book. Okay, so at this time, there were all of these pieces of evidence flatly contradicting the claims, and they're all out there, and TechnoPathology is the only one who meticulously was looking into it. So what do we have? Nothing. We have text that, if you know absolutely nothing about coercive control, might be confusing in the context of an abusive relationship, but are completely in line with very common experiences with SA, with IPV, and we have a bunch of bullshit. We don't... And those things, the things that are, I would say, are very generously the most damning against the accusers, those were already addressed in both the Tortoise Media podcast and the Lila Shapiro article. None of the new stuff was damning really at all. And, you know, all of it was focused on Scarlett too. She was the first accuser. She brought the most content. And so she's clearly the person that people are attacking the most. But like, think of it like this. Okay, even if Scarlett was a very, very weird person who, after the bathtub incident, did get into a consensual BDSM relationship and then decided to lie about it. That bathtub incident was assault. How would Gaiman know that she has such a strangely composed mind? He wouldn't. Even in that situation, it would have been consensual by coincidence. It still would have started with an assault. This is all such bullshit. I bring up all of those typos and all the grammatical errors and the logical errors and just the poor quality work, the AI, and not just to dunk on TechnoPathology because I hate him, although that is present. I said this at the very beginning, but I want to circle back to it. Given how incredibly sloppy, unprofessional, and just terrible this content is, I think it behooves us to ask, why did Gaiman share this to his, 800,000 Instagram followers? And I think that there are two possibilities. And frankly, both of them, it's not really an either or. Both could be true at the same time. One is that truly, much like Igor Goldkind is the most talented musician that's still willing to be friends with Neil Gaiman, maybe TechnoPathology is the only journalist who is willing to defend Gaiman. Honestly. Maybe if Gaiman had been willing to defy his own self-concept as this progressive guy and actually just lean in and accept that right-wingers are the only ones that'll accept him anymore, which Justin Baldoni is in the middle of doing, mark my words. Also, I was talking about this to my husband, and I was sort of musing, how I was a little bit baffled why Gaiman wouldn't just do the typical thing that people do once they've been Me Too'd, when they just go to the right. And it occurred to me, it's because he's British, and in this situation, it just so happens that one of the media institutions that's against him was the British right. That's Rachel Johnson. He didn't actually have access to those right-wing freaks who are willing to defend him. So that cleared up a lot once I realized that. But even then, that's scraping the bottom of the barrel so hard that you're eating wood. I think that if TechnoPathology wasn't saying something that was at least emotionally compelling to Gaiman, this would have been a bridge too far. One's bar can only get so low. I personally suspect that this accurately reflects how Gaiman rationalizes his alleged abuse of women. I mean, people who do this rarely want to concede that their victims didn't want it. We see this consistent pattern in all these allegations of people saying no and that kind of egging Gaiman on. I think that Scarlett is probably an informative example in that her simply being gay was enough to allegedly provoke him. And in line with that, I think that he believed that he could substitute power for being desirable. Remember that quote, "No pleasure but in meanness. Love me anyway or I'll make you." And I think that these women did not want him, that they found the idea of being with him putrid. I think that is not something the man with his monstrous ego, self-described, could accept. So his violence was a way to insist that his violence worked, that it wasn't actual violence because it was simply revealing these people's true desires, or that he was so powerful and so above them that he could force them to like him. All of the coverage of him, talks about how this relates to his childhood, how like the bathtub thing relates to his father trying to drown him in a bathtub, allegedly. And I don't really think it's that deep. I think that he is only remarkable in that he is very wealthy. He is a run-of-the-mill abuser. This is run-of-the-mill abuse. And he did it for the same reason that all these people do. They think that they can, and they think that they're entitled to. They think that their power means that women are in some way obligated to say yes to them, and that when a woman says no, that is an opportunity for them to impose that will and demonstrate that entitlement to those women. That is effectively what TechnoPathology says here. He says they actually liked it. He says the only reason they're claiming to not like it is because other women recontextualized it. Like, look at how all of this is so fucking misogynistic.